It was September, and the clouds were slate gray. It had been 3 weeks of on and off rain, which wasn't ordinary for this time of year. My brother and I tried to keep ourselves entertained, playing board games meant for 3 or more players, watching cartoons, facing off in Rock'em Sock'em Robots. The last time Kai had gone out in the rain, he came back with a fever of 102. My mom was adamant that it didn't happen again. That, and we always tracked in mud and made a mess of the place. So we were prisoners in our own home. One afternoon, my mom had to go out for the day. It was raining especially hard, I remember. She said she'd call, and we better be there to answer the phone. There was absolutely no leaving the house. We agreed, fingers crossed behind our backs, of course. Once she had gone, we quickly put on our jackets and boots and went outside into the rainstorm. We'd moved to this neighborhood only a few months prior, and one thing we loved to do was explore. Play fantasy that we were space travelers exploring some new and uninhabited planet. There were woods in the area behind our house, but they quickly gave way to more neighborhoods of cookie-cutter homes, all built the same. To be honest, to this day, I wouldn't be able to find my way out of that neighborhood. We were dead center in a suburban sprawl. When my mom drove us to school, I never paid much attention to the rights and lefts, but we must have turned 12 or 13 times before getting onto any sort of main road. My brother and I decided to play Noah's Ark. We had a long delivery box that we stood in the center of at waist height and pretended to paddle as we splashed through the gutters, soaked through with rainwater. Distant thunder grumbled, and I remember seeing my brother's eyes go wide, but in a playful way like, uh-oh, there's a mighty squall afoot. We continued our adventure up the street and around a corner onto a nearby road we hadn't been down before. These were the moments of memory, where we saw new things, ventured into new lands. It was the late hours of morning, maybe 11 a.m., and something I found odd was that all the houses had no lights on. Not just porch lights, but the lights inside. It was all dark. No cars drove by. It was Sunday, so I assumed people had gone to church. Still, it made the adventure feel all the more desolate. Immersion gripped me, and we paddled on, looking for signs of life in this strange land. We took shelter in a culvert, down a ditch where rainwater cascaded, forming a small waterfall. We discussed our mission log, what sort of alien planet this was. Our boat was in disrepair, and we'd surely need to make repairs when we got back to the station. My brother was laughing. I don't think I'd ever seen him so carefree, so jubilant. Even for a 7-year-old, he always seemed rigid and anxious. Then I spotted something behind him, deeper in the darkness of the pipe. 2 yellow eyes, staring. My brother had his back turned to it, but he looked at me with dread, anxiety. He could read whatever it was on my face. He went to turn, but I quickly changed the subject, assuring him that more discoveries awaited us, that we had to keep moving. I dragged him by my end of the box, out of the culvert, and back into the wet world beyond. We were so caught up in our adventure that I stopped recognizing where we were at all. I was used to navigating by landmarks rather than street signs. My brain interpreted symbols much better than words. But in my neighborhood, and the neighborhoods neighboring my neighborhood, all was the same. Cars parked in garages, each house had the same hedges, the same walkways, the same shutters. Outside the game, it was starting to feel all too real, like this was a place devoid of life entirely. Just cut and paste. We tried circling back. I put on a brave face for my younger brother, acting like I knew where we were going, but I was lost. Completely lost. I knew we were in trouble when we arrived at a small park, nestled in the center of some houses. Even the playground lacked any sort of personality. It was pristine, as if the instruments of fun had never been used. A slide shone in the slick of rainwater, a puke green color matching the jungle gym and monkey bars. My brother was ecstatic to have found this gem in the otherwise boring neighborhood, and climbed the rails to use the tube slide turned water slide. I smiled and encouraged him, as I thought to myself about where we'd gone wrong, how to find our way back. The rain had dimmed the sky more than it should have for the time of day, and I couldn't tell how long we'd been out anymore. Kai went down the slide, his excited scream echoing through the dark chasm within. The rain kept falling. Water ran steadily off the plastic lip of the slide. I waited. Longer than I should have before calling his name. I called it once, then again. Where was he? Was he stuck inside? I panicked and called louder. Then he came out of the end silent, white as a sheet. I asked if he was okay. He was crying silently. He said politely, in a heartbreaking sort of way, that he'd like to go home now. I asked what happened. He simply yawned and said he was cold, but I could tell something had shaken him. He was soaked through. His poncho and rubber boots had done nothing for his jeans, which were waterlogged and sodden through. I told him we would head back now. Our cardboard boat had fallen apart, lying in a pile of mush on the sidewalk. We left it there and tried to head back home. I turned to check on Kai, but from the playground where we came, in the darkness of the slide, I swear I saw two yellow eyes staring at me. They were wider now, less like a cat, more human. We walked for what felt like miles to no avail. Nothing was familiar. I knew we were in trouble. Kai was shivering, and I was also uncomfortable, my clothes sour with wet and sweat. The fun was over. Kai began to cry. I assured him we'd get back. I went to the door of the first house I saw and rang the doorbell, if only to get directions or a heading. I knew our street, Ridgemont Ave. If someone could point us that way, I could figure out the rest. But we were kids, and there was the obvious concern that an adult would see us in our state and blow the whole thing out of proportion. Then my mom would erupt when she found out. I told myself it didn't matter. We needed help. No one answered the door. I noticed all the lights were out. They must not have been home. But after 3 or 4 houses with the same result, I started to wonder if anyone actually lived on the street. Were these homes all staged, just shells? Was this some nuke town, a model neighborhood left vacant throughout? We went on further. My brother stopped crying. That moment when the body runs out of juice, and you find yourself walking, staring at your shoes, just taking it one step after another. I looked up and noticed the short stretch of woodland beside us. I wondered about the animals that once lived here before the development, where they had gone, whether they accepted their fate or died on a pilgrimage to some other forest. Yellow eyes blinked in the brush. Another set of eyes appeared a few yards away. Then another. It looked like a colony of fireflies, the eyes bobbing up and down unnaturally. I know this doesn't make sense, but something about those eyes were knowing. They were predatory like an animal's, but curious like a human. I nearly pointed them out to my brother, but didn't want to make things worse. I kept my own eyes forward and held his hand tighter, all the while seeing those eyes in my peripheral grow in number. That's when a blinding flash of light crossed my face. A cop car had pulled up. A stocky man in uniform beckoned us inside. By the time we got home, the rain had slowed and it was fully dark. It was nearly 10 p.m. My mother's face was streaked with mascara, swollen red from crying. She hugged both of us in a crushing grip, squeezing us together. Kai came down with a fever after that night. This time he ended up in the hospital. When I saw him, he was hallucinating, writhing, speaking in tongues. I wasn't allowed to see him again until he came home. Whatever it was he caught, death was near. The doctor said it was a miracle he made it. Years later, Kai told me about his time in the hospital. The delusions, the hysteria. His mind blurred sleep and waking. But the one constant was eyes. Yellow eyes. All around him. I heard the soft whimpering from a desolate street in a rural neighborhood I didn't fully recognize. It was my dog. He needed me. I could tell. He was calling to me. The barks echoed, close, but without any clear direction. They weren't coming from anywhere I could place. Something about them was wrong. Flattened, overprocessed. Like a recording being played back through the wrong speakers. I searched, opening doors to each house, one after the next. Each home was empty. Quiet. But through the silence, I heard the cries. They were coming from somewhere else. Somewhere just out of reach. I opened the last door and descended into a basement. One I recognized, but couldn't quite identify. The cries were louder now, urgent. I opened the adjoining door, and suddenly jolted awake. I'd fallen asleep at my desk. The analog clock on the wall read 11:40 p.m. I'd been studying, sitting upright. The room was dark except for the glow of my monitor. I felt a nauseating sadness rise in my throat. Like something I'd forgotten or something I'd left behind. I stood and went into the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. The reflection staring back at me didn't help. The sorrow lingered, gnawing at my chest and throat. Buddy died when I was 12 years old. He was my best friend. And I thought about all the time I'd wasted when I was young. All the hours I spent on my computer instead of being outside with him. Playing fetch, going on walks, letting him be a dog. Today, I could have excused it. I had to study, I had to work. But back then, I had no such obligation. I could choose how I spent my time. And I had all the time in the world. But it was time wasted. A childhood squandered. I cried for him then. Like I had when I was just a boy. He was the best friend a person could have. He'd lie on the floor next to me, staring up as I played computer games on my PC. His tail would wag softly when I scratched behind his ears, his favorite spot. But eventually, I'd become engrossed in the game again. He'd roll onto his back and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes until nothing came at all. That was the memory that hurt the most. I felt like there was a golf ball lodged in my throat, a burning pressure that brought hot tears to my eyes. I hadn't meant to abandon him, but intention didn't matter. I still had. Another memory surfaced then, one I hadn't thought about in years. The game. It was called Farm and Friend. Mostly a farming simulator, but there were villagers you could trade with, small quests to complete, and a dog, the friend part of the title. I'd customized the pixelated dog to look exactly like Buddy, a golden retriever with an olive green collar. He would follow me everywhere in the game. I had to log in every day to feed him, fill his water bowl, and give him just enough attention to raise his happiness meter. I'd spent more time caring for my digital dog than my real one. And one thing was the same in both worlds. I'd left them behind. I went home for the holidays and stepped into my childhood bedroom, finding everything exactly where I'd left it. My computer from another era sat on my heavy oak desk, unmoved since I was a preteen. The chair still angled slightly away like it only just stood up. I rummaged through boxes in the closet, a museum of forgotten importance. There was a photo of Buddy and I on the front lawn. He had me pinned on my back, licking my face relentlessly. In the picture, I was laughing. My face beat red, tears and slobber mixed together. Underneath were old keepsakes, Pokemon cards, a test I'd aced, a letter I'd written to my parents. Then I found the CDs. One stood out immediately, its original artwork intact. Farm and Friend. I opened the case. The disc was scratched, but not badly. I figured there was a chance it might still run. When the logo appeared on the screen, I felt my chest tighten. My save file was still there. Me and Buddy's farm. I clicked it. The homestead loaded exactly as I'd left it. I stepped outside. The fields were empty, no crops planted. I must have logged off right after harvesting the last time. I wandered into the village, intending to buy seeds, to play a little bit for memory's sake. That's when something felt off. The shopkeeper stood behind his kiosk, but his sprite looked strained. His animation looped too slowly. His eyes didn't track my character properly. He looked distracted. The dialogue box lingered longer than it should have before advancing. And also his face. His face looked older. Dark wells formed around his eyes that I didn't remember being there before. The pixels themselves seemed tired. It made me nauseous. I suddenly remembered Buddy. I turned back toward the farm. Buddy wasn't at his doghouse. The water bowl was empty. And the friend meter sat at 0. Where there used to be a blue heart icon, there was now a pulsing line, thin and near flat. I remember working for weeks to keep that meter full. Seeing it like this felt wrong, like I'd failed something or someone again. I pulled out my phone and searched online to see if anyone else had experienced this. Reddit threads were sparse. Most people shared happy screenshots. They all talked about their nostalgic joy and reunions with childhood saves. I checked Quora. There was a post asking about what happens when the friendship meter reaches 0. One answer read, "The dog dies. JK, JK." Another said, "I think they run away. You have to lure them back." If that was true, Buddy was still out there. I went back to the game and searched through the kitchen in my homestead. I found a box of friend biscuits and some crops for energy, and then I went off searching for Buddy. The forest nearby looped endlessly, critters animated in only a handful of pixels, watching as I passed. I followed the river to its end. There was nothing there. I crossed the stone bridge that looped back into the town. Villagers moved slowly now, aimlessly. There used to be fishing, and people chatting in the town square. A town crier as well. Now there was nothing. It was all quiet. That's when I heard the bark. It was digitized, flat, non-directional, like in my dream. There was no way to track it, but I knew it was somewhere in town. My parents called me for dinner, and I left the game and went downstairs. At the kitchen table, I mentioned the game. My dad laughed and said it was a miracle when I finally gave it up. I looked past him into the dark backyard. Under the elm tree was a mound of earth. That was where Buddy rested now, and forever. My mom asked what was wrong. I told her I'd been thinking about Buddy, and how I'd let him down. This was out of character, but my father said quietly that we always feel like we could have done better. With people and with pets. He said Buddy had a good life. But as he spoke, I noticed something. He looked older than I remembered. The lines on his face were deeper, and his eyes were tired. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went back to my room and logged in again. The game was where I left it. There was a day-night cycle in Farm and Friend, and it was midnight in game when I returned. The village streets were empty now. The shop doors shuttered, the lanterns dim. I guided my character back toward the homestead, thinking maybe Buddy had returned while I was gone, that somehow the game had corrected itself while I'd been downstairs. That's when I heard the bark again. It sounded different this time. Not louder necessarily, but strained, like it had been repeated too many times, copied and replayed until something essential had been torn away. It reminded me of the sound from my dream, the same flatness, the same lack of direction. There wasn't much to do in the game at that hour. The villagers wouldn't speak, the shops were closed. The only real options were to wait or to sleep. So I sent my character to bed, watching the screen fade and return a few moments later with morning light. The sky was overcast now, washed in a dull blue-gray that gave everything a heavy, muted look. I didn't remember weather being a part of the game, but the more I tried to recall details from that time in my life, the more unreliable my memory seemed. I wandered back into town, listening carefully, waiting for the bark to return. It didn't. I passed through the square, past the bell tower where the town crier used to stand. I drifted south, toward a row of houses I barely remembered visiting as a kid, places I must have passed dozens of times without even entering. I attempted to enter one of the doors, but it prompted me saying I need an invitation to do that. The house at the end of the street looked different. Weeds overtook the yard, pushing through the cracks in the fence, bending the picket fence outward, as if they'd been trying to escape for years. The front door was locked. When the bark sounded again, faint but unmistakable, it seemed to come from behind the house. I walked around back and clicked on the porch door. A short creaking sound effect, and the screen faded to black. Then I was inside the house. It felt abandoned in a way that went beyond simple neglect. Furniture sat half collapsed, cabinets hung loose from the walls, cobwebs filled corners. Whoever had designed this room had put a surprising amount of care into it. Too much care for something most players would have never found. Maybe it was some sort of strange Easter egg. The bark came again, clearer now. I followed it down the hallway to a door at the far end and clicked. The basement loaded in slowly, concrete walls, thick support beams, and a darkness that felt disproportionate to the size of the room. I walked forward, passing one beam, then another, until finally I reached a second door standing alone at the far end, almost swallowed by shadow. I heard the bark and I knew what was behind it. It was Buddy. A moment's hesitation, but I clicked it. I waited. Nothing happened. When I clicked again, I realized the game was frozen. My entire computer was frozen, and the cursor had stopped responding. A moment later, the screen shifted abruptly to blue, with lines of white text filling the monitor before I had time to process what I was looking at. I sat there longer than I should have, staring at the blue screen, waiting for something else to happen. And then my PC shut down for the last time. I took my computer to a local repair shop the next day, though I already suspected how the conversation would go. The man behind the counter examined it briefly before shaking his head. He said there wasn't much he could do, that it was impressive it had still been running at all. Machines that old weren't meant to last forever. As I turned to leave, he spoke again, almost as an afterthought. He said, "Nothing lasts forever." There was something about the way he said it that made me pause, like it wasn't the first time he delivered that line, or like he'd been repeating it to himself long before I walked into the shop. His face looked tired, worn in a way that was all too familiar. On the drive home, I thought about Buddy, about the way he used to wait patiently beside my desk, never demanding more than I was willing to give. I thought about the game, still frozen somewhere between a basement door and whatever might have been waiting on the other side. And I thought about how strange it was that I'd spent so much of my life caring for things that could be paused, saved, and returned to later, while always assuming the ones that couldn't would still be there when I was ready. We sat in the classroom as they wheeled in the television cart. The moment that metal stand came rattling through the door, half the class perked up. The other half did what we always did when the lights dimmed and the television appeared. I started fluffing up my hoodie on the desk, bunching it into something that vaguely resembled a pillow. Usually a movie during class meant one thing: a well-deserved nap. Our chemistry teacher wasn't exactly known for riveting lectures, and if the lights were going down and a VHS tape was coming out, it meant 45 minutes of blessed silence. But then, a police officer walked in behind the cart. That immediately ruled out Bill Nye the Science Guy. Instead, it meant we were about to sit through a D.A.R.E video. For anyone reading this who wasn't in school during the 90s or early 2000s, D.A.R.E was basically a long-winded campaign to tell kids not to do drugs. Officers would show up at schools, hand out pamphlets, play educational videos, and try to convince a room full of teenagers that marijuana was a gateway to immediate ruin. Even the kids who didn't smoke pot thought it was corny. The officer stood at the front of the room wearing dark sunglasses, arms folded across his chest. He looked less like a real cop and more like someone pretending to be one. The kind of guy who seemed a little too eager to look intimidating. He didn't say much. He just stood there, scanning the classroom like he was waiting for someone to slip up. The message was clear enough. This wasn't going to be a period for sleeping. Our chemistry teacher slid the tape into the VCR with a dull plastic click. The television hummed softly as the screen flickered to life, the image rolling for a second before stabilizing. And just like that, the video began. I remember the video. Most of my classmates probably do as well. But not because it was life-changing or taught us some profound lesson. It started out unintentionally hilarious. Before YouTube and the entire culture of cringe humor, D.A.R.E videos were about the closest thing we had to awkward, unaware comedy. Everything about them felt slightly off. The dialogue, the acting, the situations. It all felt like drug deals and criminal activity written by people who had never actually witnessed any of it, or even heard a believable secondhand story. Every time someone in the classroom laughed, the police officer would clear his throat loudly and intentionally. He would shift his weight, adjust the sunglasses sitting on the bridge of his nose, and stare out over the room as if daring someone to laugh again. The video itself started the way all of them did. Upbeat rock music played while quick shots of teenagers flashed across the screen. A group of kids playing basketball in a sunny park. The main character's name was Troy. The narrator made sure we knew that Troy was 14 years old and had a bright future ahead of him. Apparently, he was already well on his way to becoming a professional basketball player if he kept working hard. At some point, Troy began walking home from school. As he approached a bus stop, a shady-looking teenager stepped out from a nearby alley. The guy leaned against the brick wall, wearing a dark hoodie and the sort of expression that movies use when they want you to know someone is a criminal. He asked Troy if he wanted to buy drugs. I remember thinking at the time that the line sounded so unnatural, it was almost impressive. At that point, the video paused. Troy's confused expression froze on the screen. Our teacher turned to the class and asked what we thought Troy should do. Hands went up. People suggested he should walk away, call the police, tell an adult. Eventually, the tape resumed, and it went on like that for a while. But after a certain point, something about the video started to feel strange. For one thing, it seemed unusually long. By the time the bell for the next period was getting close, the story was still going. Troy eventually gave in to temptation. The narrator described it as the beginning of his downfall. What followed was a bizarre spiral through every possible drug cliché the writers could imagine. He argued violently with his parents. He began skipping school. Soon, he was wandering the streets looking for drugs, his life unraveling in increasingly dramatic ways. At one point, he somehow ended up inside what the video described as a crack house. I remember wondering how a 14-year-old basketball prodigy had managed to reach that point in what felt like a span of a single afternoon. But the strangest part wasn't the plot. It was Troy himself. With each new scene, something about him looked worse. At first, it was subtle. Dark circles beneath his eyes, a sheen of sweat across his face, his posture sagging more and more. Then the changes became harder to ignore. Lesions began appearing on his skin, small at first, then spreading across his arms and neck. His complexion turned pale and clammy. The healthy teenager from the beginning of the video slowly fading into something sickly and hollow. The camera moved in closer with each shot. Dutch angles tilted the frame at sharper and sharper degrees. The footage shifted to a handheld style, jittery and unsteady. It was like an art video. His face grew thinner. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets. By the time the final scenes played, he looked almost skeletal. The room had gone quiet by then. No one was laughing anymore. What had started out as a corny anti-drug film had slowly transformed into something closer to body horror. When the tape finally ended, the television screen faded to blue. The officer stepped forward and asked if anyone had any questions. No one said a word. The video itself was strange, but things became stranger a few days later. I was walking home from school when I saw Troy, or rather, the actor who played Troy in the video. He was standing outside a small coffee shop near the corner of Main Street. At first, I noticed the coughing. Loud, wet coughs that bent him forward at the waist. People leaving the cafe stepped around him, as if he were just a part of the sidewalk. It took a moment for the recognition to click, but once it did, it felt impossible to miss. It had only been a few days since we watched the tape in class. The actor was wearing the same wardrobe from the video, the same cheap basketball jersey, the same worn sneakers. His skin had the same sickly makeup on it too. Pale, clammy, dotted with those dark lesions that had slowly appeared on him throughout the story. For a second I just stood there, staring. I couldn't believe how far the school and the local police department would go to scare kids away from drugs. The whole thing had seemed ridiculous enough on tape, but now here he was, apparently continuing the performance in real life. He just stood there, waiting for the next person to come out. I headed home. At the time, I didn't think much of it, until I started seeing Troy more often. It wasn't always outside the coffee shop. Sometimes he was at the basketball court. Sometimes the laundromat, the grocery store, even outside the Blockbuster. Each time he showed up, he looked worse than the last. Every time I saw him, his skin seemed more grotesque, his eyes more hollow. The lesions spread across his arms and neck, his face growing thinner with every passing week. He looked like someone slowly decaying in real time, skeletal, emaciated, his clothes hanging loosely from his frame. At first, I assumed it was still part of some elaborate scare tactic, but after a while, I wasn't so sure. For one thing, it went on for months. Another, it wasn't makeup. I realized that the day I nearly bumped into him. He asked if I had money for a bus ticket. When he spoke, the smell hit me immediately. Something foul and rotten, like dead animals left out in the sun. Up close, the sores on his skin looked real. Too real. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started asking around to see if anyone else had noticed him walking downtown. My friend Jake said he had no idea what I was talking about. But the very next day, I saw something that made even less sense. Behind the school, near the dumpsters, Jake and a few other friends were standing with Troy. They were laughing, talking casually, like they'd known him for years. I watched Jake pull a wad of cash out and hand it to him. Troy gave him a brown bag in return. I didn't need to guess what was inside. I walked over and asked what they were doing. Jake brushed me off immediately, saying it was nothing. They were just talking. The others avoided looking at me. I thought about the video we'd watched in class, the lessons about saying no, about telling the police, about avoiding people exactly like this. I wasn't about to do all that. This wasn't a movie, and weed doesn't kill. But Troy, whatever his real name was, made my skin crawl. He looked like something out of a horror film, yet my friends were talking to him, like he was just another guy hanging around town. I couldn't tell if they genuinely didn't see what I was seeing, or if I was somehow the one overreacting. After that, I started noticing him less. The last time I saw Troy, he was walking slowly down the street ahead of me. His body had wasted away so much that I could see the outline of every bone beneath his skin. His arms and neck were covered in sores. His movement looked stiff, unnatural, like every step took more effort than the last. I crossed the street before he reached me. The image of him stayed with me long after that, and then he was gone. Troy never appeared around town again. As far as I know, he simply disappeared. If I'm being honest, I assumed he was dead. The last time I saw him, he looked like a reanimated corpse, already halfway in the grave. I know this probably makes me sound like a horrible person, but the truth is, I was relieved when he stopped showing up. The whole situation had made me deeply uncomfortable. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it all was. I had been so certain he was the actor from the D.A.R.E video, or maybe just someone who looked almost identical. Either way, he never appeared again. But my friend Jake wasn't the same after that. We stopped hanging out sometime during junior year. He began skipping school more often, drifting toward a different crowd. The last time I saw him, he looked pale, thinner than before, and I noticed something on his neck. Small sores. He had such a promising future. Gam always had nameless candies in a glass bowl, and no amount of sucking or chewing could break them into any sort of edible form. I'd always spit them out into a tissue when she looked away and pocket it to deal with later. Then she'd force another one on me, and the whole process was rinse and repeat. This was my weekend ritual, as my parents apparently wanted nothing to do with me after work was through. Gam used to tell stories about Grandpa Jackie and his service in World War II. She loved the suburb she lived in. She constantly reminded me that Jackie fought for this life, the American dream. She was all in on Americana. The buntings and flags made it look like 4th of July decorations year-round. Even during Christmas time, she would put up the tree and ornaments, but the patriotic symbols never came down. She always talked about Jackie, his stories, his courage. A tear would come to her eye. I never pried or asked questions. I didn't want to cause her any further grief than her own tellings already did. My Gam had a way with cooking. Whatever it was she made, it burned. She burned eggs, toast. Hell, she could probably find a way to burn ice water. But it wasn't all bad. Each Friday, our ritual was going to Blockbuster, and I could pick out any movie I liked, so long as it was PG. She followed rules, societal or otherwise, and parental guidance was something she took as seriously as the rule of law. She would knit on the love seat, and I'd sit on the floor watching whatever film I chose, picking through a bowl of burnt popcorn for the choice pieces. The film would drag on, and she'd drift off to sleep sitting up. I'd wake her, and she'd go up to her room. A bed was set up for me in the spare bedroom on the first floor. The home was old and made sounds at night. Not the sounds of a modern home, but something ancient and unsullied. All the appliances were decades old, too heavy to bother moving. They would be hauled out when the house was torn down one day. The refrigerator would wheeze through the night. A cuckoo clock chimed and ticked to its heart's content. Then there were other sounds. Breathing from the nearby vent. It was an old home, even for Gam's age. The radiator and vents were stylized, embellished with intricate floral designs. I noticed a sound one night coming from the vent. A loud click, then a croaked breath pushing air through the metal. Then it would slowly dissolve into silence once more. But one night, late, the breathing sounded real. It was wheezing, labored, rattling. I remember getting so scared, I hid my head under the covers and blocked my ears with pillows. The next week I went back to Gam's. I remember this time vividly. It was my birthday weekend, so Gam let me pick 2 movies. I chose The Indian in the Cupboard and Jumanji. By the second feature, Gam was fast asleep. I heard the labored breathing again. I almost laughed to myself, assuming she was making all that noise. When the second film ended, it was well past my bedtime, and I went to wake her. That's when I noticed she was sleeping silently. The breathing was coming from the vent nearby. Then it gasped, like someone with sleep apnea jolting awake. Startled, I stepped back. That's when I heard a creak. It came from upstairs. I wanted to wake Gam, to ask her if she heard what I was hearing, but some strange part of me felt like she was in on it, that she knew what it was and kept it hidden from me. She turned in her sleep. That's when I realized I had never been upstairs in Gam's house before. It was a mystery what world lay above my head. She coughed herself awake. I was standing rigid, and she didn't seem to notice. She simply asked me what time it was, and we each went to bed. It was quiet after that, and somehow, I slept easily. The next morning, Gam went out to the store. She wanted to make me her famous birthday pancakes and needed buttermilk. I watched morning cartoons as I saw her car leave the driveway. I muted the television and sat, listening. It was quiet again. I checked out the window one more time and ventured toward the stairs. They were narrow, and the top was shrouded in darkness. Heavy drapes hung from the windows, and no light penetrated the upper floor. I crept up the stairs, the floorboards creaking even beneath the carpet. As I neared the top, something struck me. A smell. Burnt food. Yams, of course, but something rotten beneath it. Something sour and foul. I reached the hallway and didn't know what to do or where to go next. I opened Gam's door. Her bed was made. A vanity and dresser stood neatly against the walls, along with a shrine to Jesus. Crosses everywhere. Crosses and photos of her and my grandfather Jackie. Younger, happy, always smiling. One photo showed them in France, another in Italy. The scent of old woman's perfume stained the air. I stepped back into the hall, nearly turning around. Then I heard the breathing again. It wasn't coming from a vent now. It was muffled, like it was behind a wall. I opened each of the remaining doors, a closet, a bathroom, a spare bedroom full of junk. That's when I heard a metal creak, sharp, like pushing on springs. A string dangled from the ceiling, the attic access. At this point, my heart hammered against my chest. What was up there that Gam didn't want me to find? Then I heard a breath so clear it made me dizzy. It was wheezing, gurgling, like lungs full of fluid. I stood motionless, afraid to move, for what were likely minutes but felt like hours. Eventually, I decided I had to know what was in the attic. I pulled the string. The attic stairs dropped down soundlessly. A wave of putrid air followed, stronger now. It smelled of rot, feces, urine. My legs quivered as I climbed step by step, peeking my head inside. It was dark and mostly unfinished, aside from wooden panels laid flat atop the 2x4s. I heard the wheeze again. It was directly in front of me now, aimed toward me. I narrowed my eyes, trying to see past the darkness, trying to hear past the pounding in my ears. I stepped forward, and my foot sank into insulation. I nearly fell, but steadied myself on something cold and hard. It creaked. A bed frame. A gasping breath full of fluid rattled out in front of me. A beaded metal chain dangled nearby. A light. I pulled the cord. What I saw still haunts me. A cadaver. Emaciated skin and bone, eyes nearly hollow. It lay atop a mattress in its own filth. A mountain of plates piled with rotten food sat beside him. His body was stained, unmoving. The body was so thin, it looked folded in on itself. Joints swollen where the skin had been pressed too long against the mattress. The plates beside him weren't old in the way forgotten things are. They were arranged, stacked, but rotting all the same. His eyes were wide. They looked at me with such terror that it felt as though we had switched places. There was something in them that I didn't have the answer for. I stepped back, nearly falling off the entry ledge. I didn't scream. I was too scared to make a sound. I climbed down the ladder using only my hands. My legs wouldn't work. I closed the attic door, went back downstairs, and waited for Gam to come home. Somehow I made it through the rest of the weekend. Gam was chipper in her old ways. A few months later, we moved across the state. I didn't see Gam on weekends anymore. and they didn't find Jackie until Gam died in her sleep 2 years later. The paramedics noticed a sound coming from the vents. When we moved into our new home, something about the neighborhood felt strange to me. By all accounts, it was just an ordinary place. A quiet street with trimmed lawns and 2-car garages. The sort of suburb you see 1,000 times driving through the outskirts of a city. But there were subtleties I couldn't shake. I was a kid back then, and kids have time to notice things adults don't. The small details. The things that don't quite fit. For a long time, I couldn't put words to it. Then eventually, it clicked. Everything was too perfect. Maybe perfect isn't the right word. It was organized, uniform. Every house looked like a copy of the one beside it. The lawns were cut so evenly, it looked like a green carpet had been rolled across the whole neighborhood. The sidewalks were spotless. It felt wrong in the way a dream feels wrong. Nothing out of place. Yet somehow everything was. I didn't learn the term until years later, but it fits perfectly now. A liminal space. What made it stranger wasn't just the neighborhood itself. It was the people. They looked like something out of a catalog. The fathers wore suits. The mothers wore sundresses. The kids had their hair combed neatly to one side. Sure, the outfits changed from day to day, but the sameness was uncanny. Like variations of the same template. When we pulled into the driveway, I remember staring at our house. Just another house. Identical to all the others. My mom was thrilled. Some of her excitement rubbed off on my sister, who was already talking about which room she wanted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was just wrong. That first afternoon, my sister and I went outside to play. Most of our things were still buried in moving boxes, but we managed to dig out a soccer ball. We kicked it back and forth in the front yard while the sun hung low over the roofs. The street was quiet. That's when I noticed 2 kids standing across the road. They weren't playing or talking. They were just standing there. One of them was staring at the ground. At first I thought maybe he'd spotted a bug or something interesting in the grass. We wandered over and introduced ourselves the awkward way kids do. Up close, I realized the boy wasn't looking at anything. He had simply been staring at the ground, like he had been paused. Only when I spoke did he move. His head lifted slowly and he looked at me. "My name's Tommy," he said. Then nothing. He just stared. His eyes didn't look focused. They weren't unfriendly or curious. They were just empty. I tried making conversation. I asked how long he'd lived here, what kids do for fun around the neighborhood, whether there were parks nearby. Each answer came after a pause. A long one, like his brain had to wait for permission before speaking. The other child never said a word. She stood at the tree in the yard, staring up into the branches as if something fascinating was happening there. But the tree wasn't moving. Nothing was. That night I explored our new home. It was pristine in the way new homes often are, though this one technically wasn't new. I remember hearing my dad mention that earlier while he was carrying boxes in from the truck. Another family had lived here before us. Maybe even more than one. But walking through the house, you never would have known it. The floors weren't just clean. They appeared untouched. The hardwood ran through the living room and down the hallways without a single scratch or dull spot, even in places where you'd expect wear. Doorways, corners, the edge of the kitchen counter. There was nothing. No scuffs and no dents. No little imperfections that come from years of people living in a place. Even the walls were strange. If you ever look closely at drywall, you'll notice little things. Slight bumps where someone spackled over a nail hole. Subtle texture differences where paint had been touched up. Houses accumulate those things over time, the way people collect freckles. But here, the walls were perfectly smooth, Not freshly painted smooth, just smooth. Like they had been printed rather than built. I wandered through each room slowly. The living room, then the dining room, then the kitchen where the cabinets all lined up in perfect symmetry. Every drawer slid open effortlessly. Every door closed without a sound. Even the hinges seemed too quiet. The whole place felt immaculate, and that's what bothered me the most. My parents were downstairs unpacking dishes. My sister had claimed her bedroom and was already deciding where posters would go. I walked into my room and looked out the window. That's when I noticed the neighbors. Across the street, they were walking their dog along the sidewalk. A golden retriever with a shiny coat. The family looked exactly like the others in the neighborhood. The father in a pressed shirt and slacks. The mother in a light dress. The kid walking just slightly behind them. But for half a second before I looked, something was wrong. The father had one foot lifted slightly off the pavement, like he was mid-step. The kid's arm was swinging forward, but none of them were moving. Like I said, this was only for half a second. They were perfectly still, frozen in place. And then they were moving again. It wasn't abrupt or like someone startled out of a trance. It was as if they just resumed. The father's foot lowered onto the sidewalk. The dog kept moving. It was so quick. At first I thought I had imagined it, but I knew what I saw. And as the family walked past the edge of the streetlight and disappeared into the darker part of the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that they hadn't started moving again until I looked at them. That they had been frozen there, waiting for a cue, like a videotape someone had paused, waiting for someone to press play. My parents didn't seem to notice when the neighbors began coming over with desserts and casseroles, as if there had been a death in the family rather than new neighbors moving in. Our refrigerator quickly began to overflow with bland, pale food. There were casseroles with barely any seasoning, cakes that looked homemade but carried almost no smell, and loaves of bread that appeared warm and fresh but tasted strangely empty. One by one, the neighbors rang the doorbell and welcomed us to the neighborhood. Each of them used almost the exact same phrasing, delivered in the same polite, monotone cadence, accompanied by the same practiced smile. It was uncanny to watch. They stood there waiting patiently while my mother thanked them. Then they would turn and walk back down the driveway toward their identical homes. My parents never seemed to think anything about it. To them, it was simply what friendly neighbors did. But the more I watched these people, the less convinced I became that any of them truly existed in the way normal people do. I could almost picture what happened after they returned home. The image formed so clearly in my mind that it began to feel less like imagination and more like an explanation. They would walk inside, close their front doors, and then simply stand there in their living rooms in a straight line, perfectly still, waiting for their cue, waiting for the moment when someone from our family rang their doorbell, drove past their house, or glanced out a window in their direction. Only then would they begin again, resuming the slow simulation of sentience they had been performing since the day we arrived. I realize how strange that sounds. The kind of self-centered thinking only a kid could come up with. The childish belief that the whole world revolves around you. But each one of my neighbors gave me the same feeling every time I saw them. It was like the lights were on, but nobody was home. All of this finally came to a head about a week after we moved into the neighborhood. That afternoon, I was carrying a couple paint cans from the garage to the front of the house. People were out and about along the street. One of the neighbors stood near his rose garden, watering the bushes with a slow, steady stream from a green hose. Another man was leisurely jogging along the sidewalk. A sedan drifted past the house so slowly that at first it barely seemed to be moving at all. At first glance, it looked like a normal suburban afternoon, the sort of quiet neighborhood scene you might see in a commercial for lawn fertilizer or real estate. That is, it looked normal if you didn't study it too closely and ignored the smaller details. My sister had left several of her dolls scattered near the walkway earlier that morning. I didn't see one of them lying half across the path until my foot caught it. I stumbled forward and one of the paint cans slipped from my hands. It struck the concrete with a hollow metallic sound and burst open. Thick white paint splashed across the walkway, spraying the shrubs, speckling the grass, and scattering droplets across the driveway in a messy constellation. For a moment, the only thought in my head was how angry my father was going to be. I tried to figure out what I could do in that exact moment to fix it, or at least make it less noticeable. Then, I looked up. Everyone had stopped moving. The car sat motionless in the street with the engine idling. The jogger stood frozen, one foot hovering slightly above the pavement. The man watering the roses still held the hose, and water continued to pour onto the plants, but his body no longer moved. Every single one of them was staring at me. It was the kind of glance you get when someone notices a small accident. They stared with a strange intensity, as if I had committed a crime so severe that words alone couldn't express their disapproval. I waited for someone to say something, for someone to laugh, or for at least one person to break the silence. No one did. They simply continued to look at me. In that moment, I felt like an intruder who had broken some unspoken rule. I was the outsider that had stained this carefully arranged community. I could feel hot tears beginning to gather in my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of them. I refused to cry in front of those things. Instead, I turned and ran for the house, leaving a trail of white paint across the concrete and onto the floor inside. I found my dad in the kitchen and wrapped my arms around him, apologizing over and over while trying to explain what had happened. When I pulled away, I noticed the trail of paint behind me stretching across the floor. My shoes had tracked it all over the entryway. It was even worse than I had thought. I braced myself for him to start yelling, but he didn't. When I looked up at him, he wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was just staring at me, the same way the neighbors had. This is one of those memories that sits right on the edge of when I started forming them. Maybe what people call a core memory. Something so strange that it triggered something in my brain. This was something you weren't meant to forget. My older brother and I used to go for walks through the neighborhood at night. My uncle had started the habit, what was otherwise an ordinary, mundane activity he called monster walks. He'd bring a flashlight and we would search the dark for anything lurking nearby. He was always trying to scare us. He'd stop suddenly and say, "Did you hear that?" Then we'd sit there in silence, waiting for the next sound. Occasionally, he'd even hide from us and make the noises himself, appearing just in time to claim he'd seen something. We never actually saw anything, but we were hooked on the idea. Horror movies scared me to death, but I still loved watching Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark? Stuff that was spooky and fun, not dark and dreary. Our neighborhood was as safe a suburb as you could imagine. So after dark, my parents eventually started allowing us to conduct our own monster walks. My brother tried to take on my uncle's role, shining the flashlight and saying, "Did you hear that?" It just never had the same effect. Still, every so often we'd go out on an adventure, clinging to the idea that one day we might stumble upon a fabled creature, ideally from a safe distance. We doubted famous cryptids like Bigfoot, Mothman, or the Chupacabra were hiding out in the backwoods of our little neighborhood. Indiana doesn't really hold creatures like that. Our intention was to find something new, a cryptid that hadn't been discovered yet. Each night we wandered the sidewalks while my brother swept the flashlight beam through the wooded areas as we passed. We must have done this a dozen times before, but one night, we found something new. We'd ventured down a different street. We like to switch things up, and that's when we stumbled upon a trail that jutted into the trees behind the neighborhood. It was nearly covered in ferns, and if it weren't for the beam of the flashlight, we probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. Walking along our suburban street was fine for me. Like I said, I like spooky, not scary. And those woods were drifting into frightening territory. There was something safe and secure about following the sidewalk on our nightly adventures. Something comforting about it. Like being behind the fence at the zoo. I didn't want to go inside where the lions roamed. But my brother wanted to see what lay beyond the trees. He certainly wasn't about to go home and ask our parents for permission. It was either stay behind alone on the sidewalk without a flashlight, or follow my brother onto the path. I chose the latter. I could hardly see where I was walking as my brother held the flashlight straight ahead of him. I just hoped I wasn't stepping in poison ivy. The forest was surprisingly lively, especially considering how close it was to the neighborhood. We heard frogs croaking and the hoot of owls. Somewhere in the distance I heard the cry of a loon, though I didn't know of any body of water nearby. It was strange. We lived in the dead center of suburbia, yet the forest felt like a massive expanse. I didn't see any backyards or houses through the tree line. Though it's worth noting, a light fog had started rolling in, which was making the flashlight less and less useful. It added to the atmosphere of a monster walk, but it certainly made spotting anything less likely. We hadn't ventured very far. It was probably half a mile, but it felt like we had been walking all night. That's when we came across the house. It was unusual. That's really the only way I can describe it. It was a suburban home, like all the others in my neighborhood, except it stood in the middle of the woods. Stranger still, it had a freshly mowed front yard and a white picket fence, partitioning the well-kept property from the otherwise untamed wilderness surrounding it. You might have assumed it was abandoned, if not for its condition. Everything was meticulously maintained, and the front porch light was on. A fresh coat of light blue paint made the house stand out like a sore thumb among the dark trees. For a moment, my brother and I just stood there looking at it. Then he spoke. He said this was definitely where monsters live. I think we were both too young to realize how out of place the whole thing truly was. It was strange, yet familiar. The house looked similar to a handful of others on our street, but something about it was off. It took me a moment to realize it, then it suddenly seemed obvious. The house didn't have any windows. Not one. A house without windows looks like a face without eyes. There's something deeply unsettling about that. We weren't sure what to do. It was probably 8, and we had to be home by 9. We knew the rules. They had been ingrained in our heads from a young age. You don't trespass on someone's property, especially not at night. We certainly couldn't just walk into the yard, shining our flashlight around looking for monsters. With no windows, at least nobody was looking out at us. At least, I thought so. My brother had an idea, one of his many bright ideas. We would ding-dong ditch. That way we could hide and wait for whatever lived there to appear in the doorway. I protested to the point where I was ready to cry. He punched me and called me a baby. He handed me the flashlight and snuck toward the fence. He quietly opened the gate, the only sound coming from the metal bracket that held it shut. In an exaggerated way, he climbed the creaking steps and hovered his hand over the bell. He looked back at me, clearly getting too much joy out of my fear and misery. Then he pressed the button and ran, not even stopping to close the fence behind him. He grabbed my arm and pulled me off the trail and into the woods, behind an overturned log and a thicket of thorns. I never heard the bell. I wonder if it had gone off at all, but my brother was certain it had. We waited there, breathing hard, watching the front of the house. I'm not sure how long we laid on the damp ground, but it felt like all night. My pulse was beating in my ears until it wasn't. Eventually, my brother said something like, "I guess the monsters are tired tonight." That's when we saw the door open. We were crouching by then, almost ready to return to the trail, and suddenly dropped once more to our bellies in the dead leaves. The door opened completely. Not like someone peeking out. It swung all the way open, and no sound came with it. It was as if the door had opened on its own. My brother's flashlight was off. The only light came from the front porch, a bulb flickering a dull yellow. It was hard to see from the distance, but beyond the doorway there was only blackness. The light didn't illuminate the inside. It was as if the door had opened on its own. We waited for an angry voice to call, but it was quiet. The door wide open, as if we were being invited inside. Then we saw something. A silhouette. It wasn't a hunchback or some grisly beast. It was the silhouette of a man. The thing that felt wrong about it was how he stood, completely straight, perfect posture, and centered in the doorway. He was as tall as the doorframe itself, and we hadn't seen a shadow approach. It simply manifested into existence, as if he were fading in. At his appearance, the light began flickering more, urgently. I waited for my brother's next quip, something like, "That's the monster," or "There it is." But when I looked at him, he looked as scared as I was, which made me all the more terrified. Then we heard the man breathing. It was subtle at first. Deep breaths, not rattling or labored, just slow and steady. Then the breathing stopped. A moment passed. I realized my brother and I had stopped breathing when the man did. The porch light went out. Everything went dark. Then I heard my brother say quietly, "Run." He didn't wait for me. He simply got up and started sprinting into the woods. I had trouble keeping up, but I ran and ran, my legs burning. Other than that, I barely felt them at all, crashing through thorn bushes and getting whipped by tree branches in my brother's wake. All the while, I heard that breathing, as if it was right behind me. A snarling wall of brambles rose ahead of us. My brother didn't hesitate. He rushed straight through it. I followed. We tumbled onto the grass of someone's backyard. The sprinklers were running. I hadn't seen the house approach. The lights, the yard, anything. One moment we were in the woods, the next we were sprawled on the lawn. We lay there on the sod, the sprinklers showering us in slow intervals, panting and afraid. Our parents were concerned when we arrived home late. The scratches all over our faces and arms didn't help. Neither did the fact that there was poison ivy throughout the woods we'd run through. We didn't go on monster walks again after that. I never went down that street again. Never looked for the trail. But I have a feeling that if I did, if I went back there in the daylight, it simply wouldn't be there anymore. I slept in the attic. I know that sounds weird, but we were a bit of a full house. I was the youngest of 7 siblings, so I ended up with the last place left. Honestly, I kind of loved it. Most of my siblings had to share a room, but I had this spot all to myself. And it wasn't just a boring box like their rooms. The walls sloped inward, and there was a circular window that looked out over the neighborhood. I had the best view in the house. The only downside was the heat. The window was small, so there was no way an AC unit could fit in there. During summer nights, I'd leave it cracked open and run a fan beside the bed. I slept with only a sheet, but I would still seemingly sweat without end. It kept me up a lot of nights, and sleeping in that kind of heat always gave me strange dreams. That's when I started dreaming about the ice cream truck. I'd hear its jingle just as I was drifting off to sleep. Ice cream trucks rarely came through the neighborhoods anymore. You might see one at the park after a baseball game, or near the community pool, but they didn't make their rounds the way they had when my parents were kids. I remember envying that a little. Even back then, it felt like a dying art. But something about the sound of that jingle, on those hot nights, it sounded wrong. I'm not sure if it was the pitch, the jingle itself, or something else entirely, but it made my heartbeat rise. So like I said, One night I dreamt of the ice cream truck. It looked old, like something you might have seen rolling through a neighborhood in the 1950s. Its once white paint chipped and yellowed with age. It stood on the street. A haze of fog surrounded it in the moonlight. The doors to the back of the truck were cracked open. I realized the fog was coming from the truck, spilling out in wisps of cold air. I was approaching the doors when something grabbed my shoulder. Before I could turn, I had jumped, jolting me awake. After that, I started noticing ice cream trucks more often. Or rather, one ice cream truck in particular. I knew it was the same one every time because of how old it looked. The faded paint, the boxy shape. It looked like it had been driving around for decades. At first, I'd only catch it in the corner of my vision, driving slowly down Main Street while my mom and I were at the grocery store. Then I'd see it parked at the end of our neighborhood, just barely sticking out from the adjoining street, like a cop car waiting to catch someone speeding. It never had the jingle playing. It would just sit there, like the ice cream man was on a break. But I never saw him. The strangest thing was that nobody ever went to it, even when there were kids outside riding bikes or playing in the street. They never ran toward it. In fact, they didn't seem to notice it at all. The truck would just sit there, quietly. This went on for some time, and all the while, my dreams were repeating. And in my sleep, I always got close to the truck, but never could quite see what was inside. One night I woke up cold for a change, but it wasn't a relief. The cold was just as bad as the heat. For a moment, I could see my breath as I woke, and I couldn't tell if I was still half dreaming. I pulled my comforter up from the end of the bed, around my shoulders. That's when something startled me so badly, I began to think I was going insane. The ice cream truck jingle. I could hear it, faintly, like the sound of a fire truck that's already passed, but the siren is still echoing somewhere inside your head. It was almost as if the sound wasn't really there at all. I looked out the small window beside my bed. Down in the street, the ice cream truck was parked, right in front of my house. I could see part of the driver's seat, but nobody was sitting there. The glow of the interior lights spilled out onto the road, illuminating the sidewalk and pavement. A cold fog rolled slowly from the back of the truck, pooling around it. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut so hard I could hear a deep ringing inside my ears. Then the jingle stopped. I stayed under the covers for a long time. Eventually, I worked up the courage to look. I lifted the blanket and glanced out the window again. The truck was gone. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the heat was already creeping back into the attic like it always did. Summer sunlight came through the round window in a yellow beam, lighting the dust in the air. It was the kind of morning where you start convincing yourself that whatever scared you the night before had only been a dream. For a while, I believed that, but I kept looking out the window. A few days passed. There was nothing unusual. I never saw the truck or heard any music, just the same quiet suburban street baking in the heat. Then came the hottest day of that summer, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt look soft and wavy, like it's melting back into liquid. My parents were both at work, and most of my siblings were gone for the day. For once, the house was quiet, which almost never happened with a family our size. I went outside mostly to escape the attic. The air smelled like cut grass and hot pavement. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler was ticking back and forth over somebody's lawn. And that's when I noticed it. The ice cream truck was sitting at the far end of the street. It was parked halfway around the corner of the adjoining road. The same place I had seen it before, with only the front half of the truck visible past the hedges. From a distance, it looked even older than I remembered. The white paint had gone dull, and the cartoon pictures of popsicles and ice cream bars along the side had faded into ghostly outlines. It wasn't playing any music. I stood on the sidewalk staring at it for a long time. I remember thinking about how cold it must be inside that truck. Compared to the heat outside, the idea of ice cream suddenly sounded incredible. After a while, I started walking toward it. I had only taken a few steps when the music started. The jingle floated down the street like it had been waiting for me to move first. It was the same tune I heard in my dreams. I slowed down. The truck didn't move. It didn't roll forward or back up like ice cream trucks usually do when they see kids coming. It just stayed exactly where it was, the music playing softly into the empty street. And that was when something about the whole thing began to feel wrong. There were no kids around, no driver leaning out the window, no movement inside the truck at all, just the music and the open road between us. A strange prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. Without really thinking about it, I changed my mind. I turned around and walked back toward the house. By the time I reached the front door, I was almost running. I didn't look back. That night, I watched the street from the attic window for a long time. The truck never came. The night after that, it didn't come either. After a while, I began to feel foolish about it, like I had imagined the whole thing. It wasn't until a few days later that I mentioned it to my mom. We were sitting at the kitchen table during breakfast. My brothers and sisters were out and about, one of those rare moments where it was just Mom and me. I told her about the old ice cream truck that had been parking down the street lately. She smiled at first. She said there hadn't been ice cream trucks in the neighborhood for years. I told her this one looked older than the ones you sometimes saw at parks or baseball fields. I tried to remember the details. The paint had faded almost to yellow, and the pictures of popsicles on the side had worn away until they were barely outlines. It had that square, boxy shape trucks used to have decades ago. Then I remembered the part that stuck with me. There was a polar bear on the front of it, a mascot. Not a picture painted on the side, but a big mascot head mounted right above the hood. I told her it looked like it had been there forever. The paint had chipped away in places, and one of the glass eyes had turned cloudy, like it had been staring down the road for years. That's when she stopped moving. The spoon she had been stirring her coffee with rested against the side of the mug. For a moment, she didn't say anything at all. She walked slowly to the front window and looked out at the street. I showed her where the truck had been parked, right in front of the house. She stood there longer than I expected, staring at the empty pavement. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded different, quieter somehow. She said when she was about my age, an ice cream truck used to drive through the neighborhood every summer afternoon. Kids would come running from every direction when they heard the music. It had a polar bear on the front. The truck stopped coming one summer. Around the same time, a boy who lived 2 streets over disappeared. Everyone thought he had run away. They searched the woods behind the neighborhood, the creek, the construction site near the highway. For a while, the whole town seemed to be looking for him. A few days later, the police found the ice cream truck. It had been abandoned in a parking lot nearly 20 miles away. There was no driver, no ice cream, nothing inside the truck at all, except for a layer of cold fog filling the cargo space. She turned away from the window and looked at me then. The only thing she asked was whether I heard the music. I told her I had. So it wasn't just me. The streetlights were the harbinger of dread. If I was still out there when they flicked on, I was going to receive hell from my parents when I came inside. I knew exactly when they triggered, the exact time. My friends did too. There were 5 of us all told, our little street gang. We ranged in age from 9 to 13. There was Sam, his little brother Sean, Nathan, Charlie, and me. I was 12, and Charlie was 13, which meant in the next year he would be entering high school. which meant he'd be too old to hang out with us anymore. I think all of us understood that 14 was the age where you couldn't have fun anymore. At least not in the same way. We rode around the neighborhood most nights. We never got into a whole lot of trouble. Mostly we drifted from one landmark to the next. Nathan's treehouse, where we bet quarters and play CeeLo, a dice game his cousin from the city had taught him. Then we'd head over to Charlie's garage, where his dad was usually working on his car. Occasionally, he'd slip us a couple beers if we promised not to tell anyone where we got them. Most of the time, we just rode around talking. For all the hours we spent doing it, I can't remember a single thing we actually talked about. One night, we'd spent most of the evening waging war with each other, pelting crab apples back and forth across the street. Afterwards, we rode our bikes a little further out than usual. There was a dirt lot where half-constructed houses stretched onward. It was a new development, an unfinished subdivision. At the far end of it, it looked like there was a much larger house than the rest. That was where the big cheese was going to live. At least that's what Sam said. We rode around the place, checking out the bones of the new constructions. There were no streetlights here, no warning signals about the time. The sun was nearly setting, so we knew we'd have to turn back soon, and it was a bit of a ride home. I remember something about that half-finished neighborhood made me uneasy. There was a darkness there. Strange shadows stretching across the unfinished houses in the dying light. We rode home, and halfway there, the streetlights hummed to life. Bats flew low overhead. I knew I was going to get a mouthful for being late. We found ourselves going back to the subdivision every once in a while, always at the end of the day, when the construction crews were long gone. It felt almost magical, watching the houses slowly grow taller, day after day. The house where the big cheese would live was set back from the rest, as if it were too good for the houses around it. I remember how tall it was. The concrete foundation was a huge drop, and didn't seem to have any way back out if you fell inside. They'd already started the walls, and a massive concrete structure shot upward. I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be a chimney chute, or some kind of medieval tower rising out of the earth. It was too soon to tell. For now, it was just a skeleton of concrete, rusting rebar jutting out in every direction. One evening, the guys were all sleeping over at Sam's house. Sean clung to his older brother's side, desperate to be a part of the gang. But he was always catching strays, the butt of jokes. We constantly called him a little baby. I'll give him this, though. He never cried. He just told us to eat farts. That night, we planned on sneaking out to the subdivision and setting off some fireworks. It was far away enough from the main neighborhood that we wouldn't have to worry too much about getting caught. Sean was anxious, but he didn't protest. He wanted to prove himself. We cracked open the window and slipped out one at a time, quietly pulling our bikes off the lawn. The streetlights glowed overhead, and we rode beneath them in the shadows, a playing card flickering through my spokes. The bats were flying blindly above us, like puppets on strings. We reached the subdivision, and it was bathed in a deep blue darkness. The full moon cast pale light over everything. It was a warm night with a chill breeze. We set off a few firecrackers as we wandered through the unfinished houses, but we all knew where we were lighting the biggest one. The mansion. The big cheese house. Sam had smuggled the firework from his own home, where he had kept it hidden in the back of his closet for months, waiting for the right opportunity. Charlie produced a lighter. He was the kid all the parents worried about us hanging around with, the one they'd blame if we ever got in trouble. We propped the firework up on a couple of bricks, and were about to light it when Sean suddenly shushed us. He'd heard something. Everyone froze for a moment. Nobody else heard anything. Just a gentle breeze, brushing the branches and leaves in the nearby woods. Someone called him a wimp. Charlie lit the fuse, and we all ran back further than we probably needed to. The firework launched upward, scraping along the concrete wall for a moment, before bursting in the air above. We all watched it, as it exploded, lighting up the sky. Something in my stomach dropped. a shadow, at the very top of the concrete structure. It was perched there like a bird of prey. I couldn't make out the shape completely. It was too high up. But I thought I saw something protruding from its back, like wings. Strangest of all, it looked the size and shape of an adult man. I know I wasn't the only one who saw it. The cheers had died away almost instantly. Everyone was quiet. As the glow from the explosion faded, the silhouette became harder and harder to see, until it disappeared entirely, blending in with the night sky. But whatever it was, hadn't moved. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Charlie finally broke the silence and asked if anyone else had seen it. Everyone shook their heads, the motion barely visible in the dark. We rode our bikes back toward the neighborhood. By the time we reached the last stretch of the block, we'd slowed to walking them, whispering back and forth about what we thought it could have been. Someone said it was a monster. Sam said it was probably just a gargoyle. There were obvious problems with that theory, like the fact that the house was a brand new construction. It didn't even have a roof. Why would there be a massive gargoyle perched on top of it? Eventually, we settled on the explanation that it was just a nighthawk. None of us really knew what a nighthawk was. If we had, we would have realized that explanation made even less sense than the gargoyle. As summer turned to fall, we didn't visit the subdivision much anymore. A few months had passed, and the sun was setting earlier and earlier. School was getting in the way of our nightly adventures. Charlie had started high school, and as we suspected, we had seen less and less of him. I started riding my bike alone when the others weren't around. They were busy with homework, hanging out with different friends, or just staying home. As Halloween approached, every now and then I found myself drifting back toward the subdivision. The decorations from the surrounding neighborhood would stop abruptly as I entered it. Many of the houses were nearly complete now. Dirt patches still sat where sod would be placed in the spring. One night I rode out there and laid down beneath an elm tree. It was quiet and relaxing, and before I realized it, I had drifted off into a nap. When I woke, the sky was dark. In the distance, I could see the streetlights had already come on. I jumped onto my bike, knowing I was in for it. Before leaving, I looked up at the big cheese house. Part of me didn't want to. It felt like looking up at the attic window of a haunted mansion. But I looked, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. In the fading light, I saw it again. The gargoyle, or whatever it was. It sat there unmoving, so still, it almost could have been alive. Just a black shape against the darkening sky, barely visible. But then I noticed its back. A wing shifted ever so slightly. My heart began pounding. I jumped on my bike and rode hard for home. At some point I looked back, just as my tires skidded from the dirt road onto the smooth concrete of the lived-in neighborhood. The top of the tower was empty. There was no monster, no gargoyle, no shape at all. The streetlights glowed dimly overhead. Bats flew low, just like they always did. There seemed to be more of them than usual that night. I looked up past the streetlights and their faint glow. The bats circled in the darkness, but something else was up there with them. It was bigger, higher, just beyond the reach of the light. Something I couldn't explain. I was a teenager in the late 90s, which meant, like many others, I worked at the mall. It was a dream job. I sat with my feet up most days, tucked inside a small office near the least used entrance, reading magazines and half-finishing Sudoku puzzles while the world drifted by outside. I loved the mall. Not for shopping. I wasn't even a window shopper. It was just the atmosphere. It was the place to be. The air always smelled faintly of pretzels and chlorine from the fountain. Music echoed from storefronts. People were always in a good mood, except when they walked into my office. You see, I ran the lost and found. You'd be surprised what people leave behind. Jackets on benches, portable phones on kiosks, credit cards tucked into arcade machines. The job wasn't hard. The hardest part was the accusations. People get tense when something personal disappears. I'd been accused more than once of pocketing valuables that came through my desk. That's the one thing I can say with certainty. I never stole anything. I never wanted to. I've never been materialistic. Most of what passed through my hands meant more to someone else than it ever could to me. Still, I handled every item personally. Logged it, tagged it, sometimes opened a wallet just long enough to find a name or number. One afternoon, I opened a wallet that was completely empty, except for a driver's license. The name inside was John Shoemaker. The address was local, nothing unusual there. What caught my attention was the age of it. The license was a thin, slightly warped card, about the size of a playing card, sealed in yellowing laminate that had begun to peel at the corners. The kind of ID you don't see anymore. Strangest of all was the photo. John Shoemaker looked like he was in his 30s, maybe early 40s at most. Thick, dark hair combed to the side with long sideburns, no gray at the temples. But the birthday read June 14th, 1946. That would have made him 52 when the wallet was found. The ID was 14 years expired. Most people don't bother carrying a license that outdated. I checked the wallet again. No credit cards or receipts. There were no folded bills or family photo tucked behind the sleeve. It was only a license. Just that frozen image of a man in his mid-30s. I ended up logging it as any other item and slid it into the filing cabinet behind me. At the time, I told myself it was just another oddity. The mall was full of things people left behind. It wasn't until later that I realized this was the beginning of something unexplainable. Days turned into months. The holiday rush crept in. My office filled to the point of bursting. Winter coats and half-wrapped gifts, cheap jewelry and abandoned shopping bags. This was the beginning of my busy season. I spent most shifts sorting, tagging, and hanging. One afternoon, while hanging a dust jacket in the closet, something slipped from the pocket and fluttered to the floor. It was a crumpled piece of neon paper. It was coffee-stained and folded 4 times over. The edges were gritty, almost sandy, like it had been handled too many times. I don't know why I opened it. I just did. Across the top, in thin black letters, it read, "Have you seen this person?" The photo beneath was faded, but the face felt familiar. Not in a clear, immediate way. More like the feeling you get when you pass someone often without realizing it. The kind of face that blends into the background until it doesn't. The longer I looked at it, the more certain I became that I'd seen him. Walking through the mall, sitting alone in the food court, riding down the escalator while I stood at the bottom. I couldn't place when or how many times, but the recognition felt all too real. It wasn't until a few days later, when I pulled open the cabinet behind my desk, that it all clicked. The man on the poster was John Shoemaker, and he hadn't aged a day. I had the license and the handbill side by side on my desk, both faded and worn. The resemblance was undeniable. What unsettled me wasn't just the photo. It was the lack of information. The handbill didn't list a phone number or a police department to contact. There was no date last seen, no height, no weight, no clothing description. Just the words, "Have you seen this person?" That was it. Seen him where? When? Who was even asking? It felt less like a call for help and more like a question directed at me. After that, even when I wasn't on the clock, I found myself scanning the mall. Not actively searching, but always aware, watching faces in passing, glancing twice at anyone with dark hair and sideburns. John Shoemaker must have been over 50 years old. The man I remembered seeing wasn't. He had a steady stride and a relaxed posture. No gray, He looked like a bachelor in his 30s at most, the kind of guy who lingered in bookstores and ate alone in the food court without looking lonely. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I hadn't just imagined him. I had seen him, more than once. It was January 3rd. I remember that clearly. I was working late, well past closing, finishing paperwork for the new year. The mall had that strange quiet it gets after hours. Most of the lights were off, leaving only the glow of neon storefront signs and blinking machines reflecting faintly across my office window. I had my head down when I heard the creak of the door. At first, I assumed it was the security guard making his rounds, or one of the janitors pushing a cart down the corridor. Then I looked up. The man was standing directly in front of my desk. I felt sick the moment I saw him. He wore a tan jacket beneath a camel trench coat, pressed slacks and brown shoes, the kind of outfit you'd expect from an office worker in another decade. His posture was straight, his hands relaxed at his sides. It was John Shoemaker. His face was pale, almost gray under the dim light, but unmistakably youthful, the same face from the license. It was the same man I had seen walking the mall. He said only one thing. "I believe you have something of mine." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. A wave of nausea rolled through me, cold and sudden. Without thinking, I turned toward the filing cabinet behind my desk and pulled open the drawer. The wallet was exactly where I had left it. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. The expired license still tucked inside. I reached across the desk and handed it to him. He reached out for it, slowly. For a moment, he looked down at the wallet, and I almost thought he wasn't going to take it. Then he did, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He straightened the lapel of his jacket, gave a small nod, and turned toward the hallway. I didn't follow him. I just sat there, listening to his footsteps fade across the empty mall. I stayed in that chair for a long time after that, mostly because I was afraid to stand up and see if he had cast a shadow. There was an emergency broadcast that played on television when I was a kid. To this day, I still don't understand what it was. The first time it happened, I was watching cartoons on the couch. We were latchkey kids. My parents were both working that weekend, and I was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, staring up at the box television in the living room. I remember the room being dim, the curtains half drawn, the only real light coming from the bluish glow of the CRT screen. Old televisions filled the room with that kind of light. It flickered across the walls and furniture, making everything else in the house feel darker by comparison. My bowl of cereal sat on the coffee table beside me, slowly going soggy while the cartoon character shouted and bounced around the screen. Saturday mornings were predictable back then. Loud theme songs, exaggerated sound effects, characters crashing into walls or falling off cliffs every few seconds. It was the sort of background noise that filled the house, even when the volume was low. I had settled into that routine, barely paying attention to the show anymore, when the television suddenly went black. At first, I assumed the channel had just cut to commercial. That happened all the time. I remember lifting my spoon and taking another bite of cereal while I waited for whatever advertisement would follow. But instead of commercials, there was a sound. A long, flat tone burst from the television speakers, loud enough that it made me flinch and look up immediately. It was the kind of sound that demanded your attention, whether you wanted to give it or not. A sharp electronic hum that filled the entire room and made the quiet house suddenly feel much larger and emptier than it had a moment before. For a few seconds, the screen stayed black while the tone continued. The television sitting there in the middle of the living room, like it had taken control of the entire house. Then the picture changed. The bright colors of the cartoon disappeared and were replaced by a solid blue screen filled with white block lettering. The text was perfectly centered, the kind of stiff government font that looked like it had been typed out on an old computer and copied directly to the broadcast feed. Across the top of the screen were the words, "Emergency Broadcast System." Below that sat several lines of smaller text that I didn't understand at the time. Something about a message from the civil authorities. The name of our county appeared in the middle of the screen, along with a few others. Everything about it looked official, but something about it also felt wrong. Then the picture changed again. A man appeared on the screen. He had a sort of gentle, familiar presence that immediately reminded me of someone like Mr. Rogers. He sat facing the camera in what looked like a plain studio room, dressed neatly, his hands folded in his lap as he looked calmly into the lens. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, not whispering exactly, but soft, the way someone might talk if they didn't want to startle a child. He said things were going to change, but that everything was going to be okay. He explained that sometimes people get scared when they see something new or unexpected, and that was perfectly normal. We all get frightened sometimes. That didn't mean anything bad was happening. I remember looking over toward my brother. We were both young, and neither of us had ever seen anything like this before. He had the remote in his hand and was pressing the channel buttons, expecting the television to switch back to something normal. Instead, the screen stayed the same. The man kept talking. The man on the television paused for a moment and then said it was very important that we listen carefully. After that, my brother slowly set the remote back down on the coffee table, and we kept watching. The man said that he would be checking in again soon, and that it was very important this stayed between us. He spoke personally, as if we were having a direct conversation, not like this was being broadcast to the whole county, or even the whole country. He said we weren't to speak of this to anyone else. This was a test, and it was very important that we followed the rules. The television suddenly flickered back to our regular programming. The cartoon had continued without us, and we had apparently missed a large portion of the episode. My brother and I didn't speak. We just stared at each other for a moment. That night, when my parents got home, I thought about telling them about the broadcast. Would they even believe me? It didn't matter, I figured. Even though the man had been clear about the rules, what loyalty did I have to some stranger on a television screen? Still, something stopped me. The words were there, sitting in the back of my throat, but they never made it out. I held out hope that my brother might say something instead. He was older, and therefore it felt like he should be the one responsible to bring it up. I kept glancing across the kitchen table while we were eating dinner. It's like he was dealing with the same blockage I was. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something deeper than that. Whatever it was, neither of us could seem to say anything beyond simple responses. Thank you. Good. Nothing. Short answers to our parents' usual line of questioning. The next day was ordinary. The day after that as well. We went nearly an entire week without anything happening, and slowly, we started to forget about the whole thing. It was late one night, after my parents had gone to bed, that I heard the television turn on downstairs. I sat up immediately and noticed that my brother was already awake, sitting upright in his bed, almost as if he had been waiting. Without saying a word, we both got up and made our way downstairs, carefully navigating steps to avoid the ones that creaked, like two kids sneaking around the house on Christmas Eve, hoping to catch a glimpse of Santa. The television was on, filling the room with a faint hissing sound of static. Then the screen turned blue again, casting a pale light across the darkness of the living room. It filled the room in a strange way, almost like being underwater, the glow stretching across the walls and ceiling, while everything else sank into shadow. The man appeared once more, sitting exactly as he had before. He repeated many of the talking points he had made during the first broadcast, that things were going to change soon, that everyone gets scared sometimes. But this time, before the message ended, he added something new. He explained that tonight had only been the beginning of the test. Up until now, all we had needed to do was listen, which he said was the easy part. Children were naturally good listeners. The next part, however, would require attention. Over the next few days, he said, we might begin noticing small things that adults wouldn't. Nothing dangerous. Nothing we should be afraid of. Just small details that might feel wrong. Adults, he explained, often move through their days without really seeing what was around them. They rush from place to place, worried about work, about schedules, about things that made them overlook what was right in front of them. Children, he said, were much better at paying attention. If we noticed something unusual, he told us we were not supposed to ask our parents about it. Adults would try to explain it away. They always did. Instead, we were supposed to remember. The man paused then, leaning slightly closer to the camera, as if he wanted to make sure we understood. Some children, he said, had already failed the test. Those were the ones who had tried to tell someone. The ones who had turned the television off. The ones who had woken their parents. But that was all right, he said calmly. The test was not meant for everyone. He smiled then, the same calm, reassuring expression he had worn the entire time, and told us we were doing very well. He had told us it would just be a few days more. The screen flickered once, then the broadcast ended again, the image collapsing back into static. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The room was quiet, except for the faint hiss of the television. Finally, my brother spoke, asking something I hadn't even thought about. He asked how the man knew we had listened. For a while, nothing happened. Life simply returned to normal. School, dinner, homework. My brother and I stopped talking about the broadcast altogether, though every now and then, I could catch him sitting in the living room, staring at the television when it was turned off, like he was waiting for it to come on again. It was 4 days later, during school. I remember the moment clearly because it was so ordinary. We were sitting in math class while the teacher wrote equations across the chalkboard. The classroom windows looked out over the parking lot and the small road that ran past the school. At some point, the teacher simply stopped writing. Not abruptly, he just stopped. He stood there for a moment with the chalk still in his hand, before turning slowly to look out the window. All of the students in the classroom followed his gaze. Outside, the road had gone completely still. Cars sat in the street with their engines running. A man stood halfway across the crosswalk. A woman beside a parked car had her door open, but no one was moving. It was like someone had paused the entire scene. The moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then everything started again. Cars began rolling forward. The man finished crossing the street. The woman got into her car. Our teacher blinked once, then turned back toward the class and asked why everyone had stopped paying attention. The lesson continued as if nothing happened. Later that day, I tried asking a few people about it. No one knew what I was talking about. Not the teacher. Not the other kids. No one. Except my brother. When I got home that afternoon, he was sitting in the living room, watching the black screen on the television. I asked him if he had seen what happened outside the school. He nodded. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said that was the moment. The moment the man on the television had told us about. The moment we were supposed to watch. I asked him what it meant. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the blank screen, before finally saying he thought the test was over. I asked how he knew. He said because the TV hadn't turned back on again. And it never did. I don't think the neighborhood I grew up in was real. I know how that sounds. It sounds like I should be institutionalized. But listen to my story, my whole story, and you can decide for yourself. Because the more I think about it now, the less sense any of it makes. I remember that Shel Silverstein book, Where the Sidewalk Ends. I don't think I ever read any of the poems inside. What drew me in was the cover itself, a sidewalk that simply stopped, dropping off a cliff. We lived in a large subdivision. You know the type. Houses of varying colors, with identical proportions, neatly partitioned lots, immaculate green grass that had a vibrance only chemicals could achieve. It was the painting of the American dream. We were middle class, but middle class meant more in the 90s than it does today. I had two best friends who lived in the houses on either side of mine, Jan and Bobby. We were still in elementary school when we started our adventures. I hadn't realized Jan would become the girl next door. We'd end up high school sweethearts years later. Bobby never made it very far. He died in Afghanistan at 19. But back when we were kids, dumb kids who believed the world belonged to us, we sword fought with sticks, built crooked forts in the woods, climbed trees until someone eventually fell and broke a bone. And one summer, at the Scholastic Book Fair, the three of us found that Shel Silverstein book. We stared at the cover. Where does the sidewalk end? It felt like the kind of mystery kids were supposed to solve. If only we knew how dark things would turn out. The school year had just ended, and summer had begun in full. Every day felt endless. Every morning we met at the cul-de-sac just after sunrise. Jan brought one of those black and white composition notebooks and a pen with 3 colored tips, a marvel from the book fair. Our plan felt foolproof. We would be cartographers this summer, map the neighborhood street by street, corner by corner. Our mission: we would find out definitively where the sidewalk ends. Our subdivision was massive. We had explored maybe a square mile of it, every cul-de-sac, every wooded lot. But beyond that was mystery. The houses simply kept going. So we packed our nearly empty school bags and set out like explorers. We found walking sticks. We joked about being knights. To us, it felt like we were the Fellowship marching toward Mordor. What was strange was as we started venturing outside the recognizable neighborhood, things began to feel quieter. It was Saturday morning, yet the driveways were empty. The houses began losing their personality. Fewer wind chimes, garden gnomes, fewer toys left in the yard. The little details that make a house feel lived in began disappearing, like displays rather than places where people actually lived. The lawns were perfectly cut, the hedges trimmed evenly. Even the sidewalk looked different. It was smooth, almost polished, as if no one had walked on it before. There were no realtor signs, nothing to suggest the houses were for sale. They just seemed vacant. Bobby decided his walking stick was now a machine gun. He was rolling around the grass, taking firing stances and whispering that Jerry was all around us and we had to stay alert. I remember wondering who Jerry was. I glanced over at Jan's map, not expecting much, but was honestly blown away by how carefully she'd been documenting everything. Street names neatly labeled, little sketches of landmarks, handwriting so clean it made me embarrassed to think of my own. We kept walking. Noon was approaching, though we wouldn't notice how sore our feet were until much later. We were cresting a fairly large hill. Bobby was complaining about how fun it would be to ride down it if only he had his bike. I still remember the look on their faces when we reached the top. From there, we could see a vast expanse of neighborhood below, and it was all just more of the same. rows of houses stretching in every direction. We couldn't see an end to it. From that height, the whole subdivision looked like something growing in a petri dish, the streets spreading outward like veins. Still, the sidewalk continued. Before we could see that something was off. Now it was more of a feeling, something you couldn't quite explain. Everything was there, but something about it felt incomplete. If you glanced at a house quickly, it looked normal enough, but if you stared for more than a moment, the details didn't seem right. The wood siding looked too smooth, like the grooves had been sanded away. The windows reflected nothing. Even the grass didn't quite move in the wind the way grass should. It looked more like turf, artificial. Something unspoken passed between us in that moment. We were alone. We knew nobody was home. And we knew we could look into windows and slip into backyards without anyone calling out angrily. There would be no dogs barking, no voices telling us to leave. We knew this place simply wasn't real. Bobby went first. He squeezed between a pair of hedges and peered into a set of windows. Jan and I followed slowly, crouching beside him and whispering, asking what he saw. I half expected the inside to be empty, just a hollow shell, but the houses were furnished. Only the furnishings were wrong. A plain living room set, a box television, a clock on the wall. Everything you would expect to see inside a suburban home. But the television was off. The furniture looked untouched. The clock wasn't ticking, and everything lacked the small details that make a place feel alive. The room looked less like a home, and more like someone's crude interpretation of one. We moved to another house and looked inside again. That's when the dread really began to settle in. Each house we checked, each living room and backyard, they were all exactly the same. The colors of the houses changed, but the interiors never did. That was the moment I realized we had stumbled upon something we weren't meant to find. It was also the moment I felt certain we were getting closer than we ever had before to finding out where the sidewalk ends. Jan and Bobby were trailing behind me as we continued up the street. We had agreed that we should turn around at 3 p.m. We would have to retrace our steps quickly to get home before dinner time. We were approaching that point, so I was picking up the pace. I knew we were getting closer to the end. I could feel it, as each house began losing more and more detail. The colors were gone now. Each house was white, the lawn green, and the interior stripped down to the barest details. There was no paint and no rug. Each house progressively minimized. We had reached the point where we looked in a window, and all that could be seen was a single white couch, absent of any texture. Jan was getting anxious. I was too, but it was like watching a movie. I had to see the ending. I think all of this would have been more uncanny if we were older, if we had realized this isn't how homes are constructed. They don't slowly develop features, details, furniture, and occupants. In our young minds, I'm not sure we ever questioned it. There was just something in the back of our heads telling us this place was strange. The neighborhood continued, if you could even call it a neighborhood anymore. Each lot was partitioned, like the ones before it, but the missing features could no longer be ignored. One house simply didn't have windows. Another had half a door. Each one was white, flat, and without defining features, and each one had something missing. The road had become a flat gray strip. The sidewalk continued, but the cracks were gone. Bobby and Jan called out to me. I was so engrossed by all of this that I hadn't paid attention to how far ahead I'd walked. They were further back now, standing at the start of the strange unfinished street. They called to me again, saying it was time to turn back. I could hear the fear in their voices. I told them I just needed one more minute and pushed forward. They protested, but I didn't listen. I kept walking. The houses were half houses now, like a home sliced clean down the center. Eventually, there were no longer houses at all, just perfect squares of grass. Grass without texture, perfect partitions of featureless green. I watched as the sidewalk went on around the bend, on and on until it didn't. This was it. I'd found it. I'd found where the sidewalk ended. But unlike Shel Silverstein's book, it didn't fall off a cliff. It wasn't comedic or cinematic even. In front of me was simply a forest of trees, but they stood in stark contrast to the surrounding neighborhood. The forest was real. The texture of bark and leaves, brush and ferns. I looked back. The neighborhood looked wrong beyond what I could comprehend in that moment. It's one of those things where you grow used to something unnatural. After a while, it begins to feel ordinary. But seeing reality and the neighborhood side by side, I knew. This neighborhood was an anomaly. It was wrong. I looked down at my feet where I stood on the sidewalk, the unfinished texture, the flat terrain. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the eye, but as I kept watching, I knew it was true. The sidewalk was growing outward, slowly extending toward the forest ahead. It wasn't the end. If anything, it may have only been the beginning. I was a security officer at the Somerset Mall. I'd been there for 6 months at that point, and that's when I started noticing something strange. My shift had changed and I had begun working the later window. It was mundane work, walking the corridors, checking the store gates, making sure nobody was tucked away in fitting rooms or bathrooms. Then I'd spend most of the night watching the CCTV set. It was pretty cushy for the most part, busting teens trying to stay after closing, or escorting a homeless man off the property. It was routine. I was the guy who whistled while he worked, keys jingling on my belt. I enjoyed the uniform, the small authority I was given. I followed the same patrol every night. I'd cross the food court, head down one corridor and toward the next. There were a few other security officers, but we covered different sections and communicated via walkie-talkies in the rare event something went wrong. When you follow the same patrol long enough, you start noticing things. You start counting the checkered tiles of varying colors. The storefronts and display windows became my milestones. I guess that's when I first noticed. Penny had moved. Penny was just a nickname I ended up giving the mannequin later. One of several mannequins in the JCPenney window. She didn't have any defining features outside what she wore. It was just a mannequin after all. But one night, after passing that window God knows how many times, I looked in and saw she'd shifted. It was subtle at first, barely enough to register. But I looked into that window every night, and on this night, she was set back from the others, slightly off-center, head angled a touch to the side. It was enough to make me stop, though not enough to cause alarm. The merchandisers must have been in a hurry and neglected to position her properly. But I think that's when I started paying attention, and that's also when things started getting, well, weird. The next night, Penny had shifted further back. The night after that, further still. Then one night, Penny wasn't there at all. She must have been pulled from the floor set, but there was a strange gap where she once stood. You'd think they'd add another mannequin to fill that space, or slide the others inward to create a more uniform display. Corporations take their storefronts seriously. It had been nearly a week. I'd make my rounds, and there would be no Penny. Then she was back, but not where she belonged. I remember turning the corner toward the JCPenney storefront and feeling my stomach rise into my throat. Penny was standing in the hallway. She was facing me, as if anticipating me. My heart hammered. I was actually shaking. It was so unreal. A dark, empty mall, and this mannequin, wearing a sleeveless satin dress with silver strappy heels, standing there in the corridor, looking at me. That was the part I couldn't explain. I suppose these were the dangers of giving human traits to something devoid of life. I'd given her a name, and in doing so, I'd given her the power to scare me. The fear only lasted a minute. She didn't move, didn't blink. It was a mannequin. I unlocked the gate and disabled the alarm. I threw Penny over my shoulder like we were honeymooners and carried her back inside, placing her as neatly as possible in the display window. I locked up and stepped back. There she was again, back where she belonged. All was right once more, until it wasn't. Before the next shift, I approached Richie and Seth. We were the sort of kind of friends who grabbed drinks on off days and played poker here and there. When I mentioned the mannequin, they looked at me in a mild amusement, unsure where I was going with all this. I described what had happened the night before, and based on their reactions alone, I was fairly certain they had nothing to do with it. They figured it was some kid playing a prank, maybe even an employee, bored out of their mind. If it happened again, I should report it. We had camera feeds covering that corridor. We could always scrub the playback. That night, after finishing my rounds, I planned to do exactly that. I passed the JCPenney storefront and found Penny had escaped again. I continued through the mall, half expecting to find her around every corner, ready to startle me. But I made it all the way back to the security room without seeing her. Where did Penny go when nobody was watching? I had to stop thinking like that. Stop thinking of this mannequin as if it were a real person. It was beginning to disturb me. Back at the console, I pulled up the previous night's footage and scrubbed through. There I was, placing Penny back in the display window. I rewound further. There she was, standing in the hallway. I kept going back to when the stores were still open, and there were shoppers moving through the corridor. I slowed it down. The last wave of customers drifted past the storefront. Then Penny was there. I slowed it further, frame by frame, leaning in close to the monitor to make out the grainy details. Through the low-resolution haze, I saw something. A woman exiting JCPenney. She wore a satin dress, silver heels. She paused, the image blurred in the movement of the crowd. But Penny stood there. I replayed it again and again. The quality was poor. A woman walked out of the store, stopped, and remained, until I carried her back inside. I monitored that storefront for weeks afterward, but Penny never returned. Eventually, they filled that space with another mannequin. How I knew it wasn't her is hard to explain. I just knew. I worked there another 18 months before finding a new job. Occasionally, I'd catch myself thinking about it. What had happened, and how. It was something you couldn't share without sounding unhinged. Even if somehow I'd stolen the tape, the footage wasn't clear enough for anyone else to see what I'd seen. It was one of those things. You had to be there. 2 weeks ago, I went back to the mall. It closed in 2015, nearly 2 decades since I'd worked there. Strange to think I once spent so much time keeping people out, and now I was trespassing. It wasn't difficult to get in. One of the rear service doors hung loose from its hinges. I stepped inside and followed my old patrol one last time, just for memory's sake. Past the food court where the once colorful tile floor was cracked and dulled by years of grime. Dust floated through beams of dim light. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily. I stepped over broken glass and debris as I passed storefronts, some still bearing fragments of their old lettering. Graffiti covered the walls until it didn't, as if even vandals eventually grew tired of defacing a place no one would see. I reached the J.C. Penney. The branding was gone, but I knew. The corridor stood silent. Inside the display window was a single mannequin, stripped of clothing, filthy and bald and streaked with years of decay. She stood there, head angled slightly toward the corridor, toward me, as if anticipating my arrival all these years. And I knew. It was Penny. As if she were saying something without saying it at all. Look at us. We're still here. We never left. I grew up in the middle of nowhere. A lot of people say that about their one-horse town, but truly, my earliest memories are of endless fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, where the land seemed to dissolve into the sky. I'll spare the details of exactly where the house was, but we were in Kansas. The nearest town with a grocery store was 40 miles away. We were completely isolated. I wish I could say it was boring, but something about that place always felt wrong. My mom married my stepfather when I was 3 years old. We moved from St. Louis to his farmstead, the one out in the middle of nowhere. The house itself looked ordinary. If you saw it on a suburban street, you'd think nothing of it. But here, it felt misplaced, like it had been dropped there by mistake. The yard was perfectly kept, a bright square of green grass. Beyond the fence was nothing but dead land, dying weeds, and brittle wheat that rattled in the wind. The house was painted white, not the soft white of old farmhouses, but a bright, blinding white that reflected the sun so harshly it hurt to look at in the summer. Sometimes I would squint at it and feel like I was staring at a lighthouse in the middle of an empty sea. And then there was the rainbow. Summer storms rolled through often. The clouds would darken the sky, and the wind would whip across the fields. But the rain never seemed to fall hard enough to help anything grow. Everything out there stayed dead. Always dead. When the clouds began to break apart, a rainbow would appear. My younger stepsister loved rainbows. Unicorns too. All the things little girls are supposed to adore. She would clap and point and run outside to see it. But something about that rainbow always made me uneasy. We watch The Wizard of Oz every year. Most people in Kansas take pride in that movie. At least I think. I remember the first time we watched it. During a storm on our old box television set. Seeing the tornado rip through the farm and lift Dorothy's house into the sky in bright Technicolor. Everyone else loved that movie. It deeply disturbed me. Watching that house spin away made me think of our own home, about the fact that we lived right in the middle of tornado country. We didn't have a storm cellar, nothing underground to hide in. I used to lie awake during storms and wonder what would stop our house from being picked up and thrown somewhere else. Sometimes I wondered something worse. What if it already had been? What if the house had been blown away long ago, and this was simply where it landed? After storms passed, my sister and I would wander outside and stare up at the rainbow. It always sat in the sky, at the same strange angle. One end disappeared behind a distant hill, just beyond the cresting wheat fields. We never walked very far. Not because we were afraid of getting lost. The house shone so brightly you could see it from anywhere. It was more that there was nothing out there worth finding. Still, the rainbow must end somewhere. I decided I was going to find out where. The song from The Wizard of Oz had been stuck in my head for days. Somewhere over the rainbow. The idea finally took hold in my mind all at once, and without hesitation. Follow the rainbow and find its end. I packed a crude bindle with snacks and a few tools, a compass and a small pair of binoculars. In truth, I was more interested in pretending to be a wanderer than preparing for anything serious. My stepsister was around 4 at the time. She begged to come with me, but I promised her I would come back as soon as I discovered what was waiting at the end of the rainbow. If you're wondering where my parents were, my stepfather was seldom seen. He might have lived in the house, but I rarely saw him. Sometimes he would simply appear in a doorway or a hallway, as if he'd been standing there all along. My mom spent most of her time sleeping. Later, I would understand that she wasn't just tired. She had her own demons she was trying to escape. But at the time, it simply meant I had free reign. Nobody noticed where I went or how long I was gone. As a kid, I never stopped to think about how dangerous that might be. I set off after the storm had passed. The rainbow was still faint, slowly brightening as the clouds drifted apart. That gave me time to follow it. It stretched out toward darker clouds gathering along the horizon, and somewhere beyond those clouds, I knew the rainbow ended. I began walking through the fields of wheat, the brittle stalks snapping and crunching under my sneakers with each step. Occasionally, a cicada would burst from the ground and leap away, the sudden whir of its wings making me flinch. I expected the end of the rainbow to come into view after the first hill I crested. The hills weren't very large. That area in Kansas doesn't really have hills, so much as gentle rises in the land, small bumps in an otherwise endless plain. But when I reached the top and looked out, the rainbow was still there in the distance, stretching farther ahead, as if it had moved while I walked. I crested another hill, and another. Each time the same thing happened. The rainbow slid farther away, still leaning against the dark line of clouds on the horizon. It almost looked as if it were growing. I walked for a long time. Eventually the sun broke through the thinning clouds and came down hard, the kind of blistering summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the ground. I stopped to take a break. I drank some water and pulled out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich I had wrapped in wax paper. I sat on a lone rock in the middle of the field. There weren't many hills out there, but from where I sat, I noticed something strange about the land around me. The ground rolled gently in every direction. The small rises formed a circle around me. I was sitting in a valley. That was when I saw something in the corner of my eye. I know how this is going to sound. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was moving slowly down the side of one of the hills, toward the end of the rainbow. But something about it immediately felt wrong. For one thing, it didn't quite look like a deer. It looked like something wearing fur. Wearing. That was the only word that fit. The shape of it was wrong. Its body stood too upright. For a second, it almost looked like a person, except taller. Much taller. And all wrong. I only caught a glimpse of it before it passed over the hill and disappeared. I told myself it had to be some kind of animal. My brain kept trying to correct what I had seen, to turn it into something normal. But that feeling wouldn't go away. And as I watched the hill where it had vanished, I noticed something else. The rainbow had stretched farther again. And beyond it, the clouds looked darker than they had before. The next hill I crested revealed something strange. The rolling landscape had given way to a vast open field. So wide, I could see distant rain falling in a gray sheet. The clouds were jet black over the next embankment, likely at least a couple miles away. I thought about turning back then, but something made me hesitate. The rainbow, which by all rights should have faded into nothing by now, continued on. And over that last hill, deep down, I knew the end of it was there. But the clouds above it were vicious. I saw the first faint hints of funnels beginning to form. Tornadoes. It sounds crazy, I know, but I had already come this far, and I knew that if I turned back and tried again another day, I might just run into the same thing again. So I kept walking, then began to walk faster, trying to reach the end of the rainbow before it vanished, before it would be swallowed by something darker. As I walked through the field, I kept watching for the strange creature I had seen earlier. I had no idea where it could have gone. I had started walking only a few minutes after it had crested the hill, yet now I stood in a massive open field, and there was no sign of it anywhere. More than once I checked over my shoulder, half expecting to find it hunched over, stalking me. But it wasn't there. It wasn't anywhere. The clouds above were beginning to churn, thunder rumbling somewhere deep inside them, as if warning me not to come any closer. The rainbow remained. But to my horror, I noticed it was fading. I began to run. I was nearly there, just one more hill to crest. If the rainbow somehow stretched beyond that, I would know this was a lost cause, and it would be time to turn around. But something inside me kept screaming, "It's here! It's here!" That thought alone pushed me forward through burning calves and a dry, aching throat. I was already exhausted by the time I began climbing the hill. At one point, I was just staring down at my shoes as they crushed the wheat beneath me. When I finally looked up to see how much farther I had to go, I saw the creature again. A wave of nausea rolled through me. It was the being at the end of the rainbow. It wasn't anything whimsical like the Wizard of Oz. I never saw its face. It had its back to me. But some things were unmistakably true. Its arms were long, stretching almost to its knees. Its fur was matted and uneven. It stood upright on legs that looked like a deer's, long and jointed wrong, too tall for the rest of its body. It never looked at me, but I saw one of its ears twitch, as if it sensed something behind it. Then it bolted. The way it ran was uncanny, not like an animal, not like a deer. It moved like a tall, gangly human who had never quite learned how to run properly. I stopped where I was. For a moment, I wasn't sure I could keep going. My heart was hammering in my chest, and now I knew the end of the rainbow was not meant for my eyes, but it was right there. For a long time I stood there, watching the rainbow fade more and more with each passing second. I had to know. I had to know what was there. So I crested the hill, following in the creature's wake. I reached the top of the hill and looked down. There it was. The rainbow faded straight into the earth, barely visible, through the rain that had begun to fall the moment I reached the summit. The storm had arrived in a full fury. Sheets of rain swept across the fields, bending the wheat flat in the wind. It was dark. At first, it looked like nothing more than another stretch of farmland. Then I saw them. Vents. They dotted the valley floor like tiny volcanoes. At first, I thought there were dozens scattered across the field. Then lightning cracked across the sky and illuminated the valley. There were hundreds. Maybe more. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I knew deep down where it had gone, and many others like it must have lived inside those vents. I knew then that the true Oz lay beneath my feet, hidden somewhere in the subterranean labyrinth those things called home. But I wouldn't go any closer. The storm above was becoming savage now. I could see the shape of the funnel from earlier beginning to descend in the distance. A tornado pushing its way toward the ground. It looked far away, but those things can be deceiving. Distance in a valley like that can play tricks on you. And then a terrible thought struck me. The only place I could take cover, if the storm reached me, would be inside one of those vents. I would have to climb down into whatever waited below, into that hellish Oz, with them. Another bolt of lightning tore across the sky, and in the darkness of those holes, I saw them. The faintest glimmers of blue. Eyes, glowing from deep within the vents, staring outward into the storm. I ran. I ran toward the homestead. The rainbow was gone now. The wind pushed hard at my back, as if trying to shove me forward. For a long time, I didn't dare look behind me. I was certain a tornado was forming somewhere in the storm. The wind screamed in my ears. Rain stung my face, then turned to hail. The rain was hammering down now. I began to wonder if I'd lost my direction. My legs burned, and eventually they simply gave out beneath me. I fell hard into the wheat. When I tried to stand, they wouldn't work. My breathing turned frantic. I began hyperventilating, panic rising in my chest. My hands curled into claws, and a tingling numbness spread across my cheeks. For a moment, I thought I might die and become one of those things. I forced myself forward anyway. At first I walked, fast and clumsy, then slowly broke back into a run, and then I crested a hill. There was the homestead. It shone like a beacon in the distance. A strange beam of sunlight had broken through the clouds and fell directly on the house, while the sky around it remained black with storm. I ran for it. By the time I reached the yard, the storm had overtaken everything. Rain and hail battered the roof and windows. I burst through the door, expecting my mother to be there, furious and worried. I expected my stepfather to be waiting too, staring at me in that cold, cruel way of his. But neither of them were there. The house was dark. The power had gone out. I ran to my room and climbed into bed, pulling the comforter over my head. I lay there for a long time. The smell of rain clung to my clothes, sharp and acidic, and my own breath made the space beneath the blanket hot and suffocating. But I was afraid to look outside again. Then I heard a voice. A whisper. It was my stepsister. She asked if I had found it, if I had found what was waiting at the end of the rainbow. I slowly pulled the comforter down. She was standing in the darkness at the foot of my bed. She asked again, what was it? I planned to tell her there was nothing there. No pot of gold, no unicorn, that the rainbow had simply faded away before I ever reached the end. But then I looked at her eyes. They shone ever so slightly blue in the darkness. And I realized something. She already knew the answer. I was what you'd call a cinephile. In the days before streaming services, even before Netflix was something you received in the mail, I collected movies. I'd spent most of my adult life watching films. I would wander electronics and entertainment stores in search of titles I had never seen before. It was like collecting stamps or coins, the same impulse, the same quiet satisfaction. Oftentimes, I was more fascinated by the cover art on the VHS case than the lackluster film etched onto the tape inside. 3 of my 4 office walls had built-in shelves, and on those shelves sat my collection, my pride and joy. It extended into the walk-in closet as well, which housed rows upon rows of titles rather than clothing. I had considered decorating with posters or memorabilia, but I didn't want to sacrifice wall space that could be used for more films. A single box television set in VCR sat on my desk at one end of the room, surrounded by stacks of tapes that hadn't yet been filed into my very particular system. This was my cave of solitude. At least that's what I started calling it. After the 9 to 5, I would stop by a store, pick up a few new films, and spend my evening watching a triple feature while eating takeout by the glow of the television. I did this for years. I built shelves in my hallway and living room, each lined with VHS tapes of varying quality. There were no duplicates. I cataloged every one of them with painstaking attention to detail. Eventually, the collection occupied every wall in my bedroom and even went into the bathroom. That's when I began to feel something close to panic. Not because I suspected the habit had grown strange or out of hand. That thought had not yet occurred to me. I panicked because I was running out of space. I considered gutting the kitchen, and installing shelves where the pantry doors were, but that would have been a surefire way to lose my security deposit. I tried to be content. I even entertained the idea of discarding older tapes, especially those I hadn't enjoyed, simply to make room for new acquisitions. But the thought made me nauseous. The collection was a testament to my passion, and my passion was only expanding. Why shouldn't the collection expand with it? In the spring, I received a promotion, which brought with it a substantial increase in disposable income. I had long noticed that the neighboring apartment had remained vacant for the entirety of my time living here. When I asked the landlord about it, he told me it wasn't for rent, which confused me more than I expected. I pressed him. He said it was a gut job, his words, and that it just wasn't livable. I offered double what I was paying for my own unit. He hesitated, but ultimately conceded. The offer was difficult to refuse. The new lease agreement allowed me to install an adjoining door, connecting my apartment to the unfinished one. It was perfect in every respect. Skeletal, bare walls, high ceilings, and over 1,000 square feet of raw possibility. I realized then that my ambition could finally be complete. I purchased shelves, enough to line the walls and create aisles down the center of the space. It resembled something of a private blockbuster. For a short time, it remained mostly empty, and that emptiness unsettled me. I seemed incapable of satisfaction. If the space was vacant, it felt incomplete. If it was full, there would be no room left for growth. So I accelerated. I exhausted nearly every local store and began venturing farther into the outskirts of the city in search of titles I didn't already possess. I carried my notebook everywhere, page after page of films I owned, all in alphabetical order. I would flip through it as I examined each tape. I must have looked less like a customer and more like someone conducting inventory. It grew increasingly difficult to locate anything unfamiliar. Eventually, I turned to eBay, hunting for indie releases and obscure titles. The shelves filled rapidly, and with them came a familiar tightening in my chest. The days blurred into one another, each defined by the same obsessive ritual. I scarcely even had time to watch the films anymore. My hours were consumed by acquiring, cataloging, and filing them away. If I passed a shelf and saw a tape protruding half an inch, I would slide it back until it was perfectly flush. I measured rows with a ruler to ensure uniform spacing from the edge. Dusting became a weekly obligation. Then the inevitable happened. It was full. Again. Every shelf, every aisle, each square foot of wall space, it had all been claimed. I tore through both apartments, searching for some overlooked corner where additional shelving might be installed. But every recess had already been consumed. I had amassed 20,000 films. 20,000. The number felt insufficient. There were more out there, and I wanted all of them. That was when I noticed a loose cinder block in the far wall of the unfinished apartment. It jutted outward, just enough to suggest something behind it. I removed it and peered through the opening. Nothing but darkness. I reached inside. Cool air pressed against my skin. I paused, briefly considering what I was about to do, but desperation overrides reason more easily than one might think. I purchased a sledgehammer at the Home Depot and returned that evening. I worked carefully, as quietly as one could, while chiseling away at the wall, until I created an opening large enough to crawl through. I crouched and vaulted over it. Dust hung in the air like fog. I switched on my flashlight and aimed it into the void. It was another room, larger than the one I had just spent the better part of a year filling. At the far end, something caught the beam, a faint shimmer. I squinted against the particle haze, my lungs protesting the debris. The light struggled to pierce the thickness of the air, but eventually I made out what stood there. A single shelf. I felt my pulse begin to race. The shelf was full. It was rows of tapes. They were all unlabeled and uniformly black. There were no doors or windows and no visible source of light. There was only the vast, hollow expanse, with that lone collection standing at its edge. I stared at it for a long time, overcome not by fear, but by recognition. I decided to take a tape. I told myself I was just borrowing it. A fellow collector would understand. I returned through the opening, sealed behind by darkness, and walked back through my aisles. The tapes lining my walls seemed to lean inward, as if assessing what I had brought home. I placed the tape into the VCR and waited. Scan lines flickered against the black screen for nearly a minute. I considered ejecting it, assuming it was blank. Then something shifted. At first, I thought it was my reflection in the screen. The television's curved glass often returned a dim image of whoever sat before it. I leaned forward and saw the outline of a man in a chair. My chair, in a room unmistakably like mine. His face was obscured by shadow, backlit and indistinct. I nearly laughed and adjusted my posture. But the man adjusted too. There was a delay, subtle, fractional, but present, the kind you only perceive once your mind is primed to notice it. I raised my hand. He raised his. Not simultaneously, but he followed, a half-second behind, as though awaiting instruction. A cold sensation crept up my spine. I leaned closer until my breath fogged the glass. The image did not fog in response. I stared inches from the screen. I blinked. As my eyes reopened, so did his, but slower, deliberate, as if savoring the motion. A sound escaped me, involuntary and raw. I struck the eject button. The image vanished instantly. The tape slid free with a mechanical whir. I sat in silence for a long time, just listening to my own breathing. I returned the tape to the shelf in the adjoining room and slid it back into its exact position. I had no desire to examine the others. I patched the wall crudely, enough to obscure the opening from view. As I walked through my aisles again, something fundamental had shifted. My collection no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt oppressive, as though the shelves had grown taller in my absence, and the air itself had thickened between them. It took weeks, but I dismantled everything. I donated what I could, discarded the rest. Strange how quickly you relinquish objects that once consumed years of your life. I hired a mason to repair the wall properly, and I terminated my lease soon after. I told myself the obsession had run its course, that it had been unhealthy, unsustainable. I told myself I was relieved. I haven't owned a television in months. The quiet is different now, but there's something nice about it. I decided to take up a healthier hobby, something slower that'll keep me more grounded. I began reading. I find myself drawn to first editions, to pristine dust jackets, hardcovers only. Paperbacks bend too easily. I like the weight of them and the way they align when shelved properly, when the spines are even and the edges are flush. The spare bedroom has good wall space. I tell myself I'll keep it modest this time. But the shelves, they're filling quickly. We had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight when the car started to make a strange hissing sound. That was new. It was an '87 Pinto, only 5 years old, but we could tell already it was a complete lemon. I knew it didn't really have the legs for a drive like this, but we didn't have much of a choice. Trish and I had crossed the state border a while back without much ceremony. Nebraska into South Dakota doesn't offer a whole lot in the way of interesting road trip stories. We'd passed through Pine Ridge, and we're back on a strip of highway with little to nothing to look at. It was all just fields and sky, and more of the same road disappearing ahead of us. I thought about turning back. Maybe there was a shop in that last town, but everything seemed fine. It was just that hissing sound. Trish was asleep in the passenger seat. She had taken the graveyard shift earlier in the drive. I thought about waking her, but decided to let her rest. I didn't have the map out, but I knew we were heading straight north, as the crow flies, for the foreseeable future. The sun was already starting to set. 8 hours had felt like a blink. But as I looked out over all that nothing on either side of the road, I started to feel uneasy. Uneasy that we were going to break down in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, and no payphone for miles in either direction. Then the car started to cough black smoke. Well, that settled it. I pulled off onto the shoulder of the road. We were likely 30 or 40 miles from the nearest one-horse town. Trish woke to the sound of gravel and the smell of something burning. She was just as worried as I was, though we both tried our best to hide it. I popped the hood and stared into the mess inside. It was bad. A wall of smoke hit me in the face immediately. I didn't know anything about cars then. Honestly, I still don't. Trish didn't either. But even we knew this wasn't something we were going to fix on the side of the road. That meant walking. The day had been brutally hot. I knew that much because the AC never seemed to work in that car. But the sun was nearly gone now, and the air was cooling down fast. Walking in the dark seemed like our best option. We checked the map, but that only made things worse. We were stuck somewhere between two towns. What either of them could offer was anyone's guess. We didn't remember seeing a mechanic in the last one, not even a gas station. So we decided to head north. We had been walking along the road for maybe an hour when Trish pointed ahead. Lights. At first I thought it was a town, but it wasn't. It wasn't a little shell station either. From a distance, it almost looked like a Walmart. Some kind of massive department store dropped out in the middle of the plains. The lights gave it the strange appearance of a carnival. It was all red, yellow, and blue. They were strung in long arcs across the building, glowing against the darkness. We continued walking toward it, trying to get a better look. After another couple of miles, we finally reached it. It was a gas station, but not like any gas station I had ever seen. It reminded me a little of those giant travel stops you hear about, places like Buc-ee's. There had to be over 100 gas pumps, all of them perfectly clean, standing beneath a massive concrete canopy. The storefront behind them was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows lit up with neon signs, advertising cigarettes, beer, fresh food, and ATMs. The strangest part was how empty it was. I guess it made sense. It was close to midnight, and we hadn't seen a single car on the highway during the entire walk. Still, something about that place made my skin crawl. When something is that clean, that polished, it starts to feel wrong. The station looked like an eyesore in the endless darkness around it. It didn't belong there at all. One thing that was especially strange was the lack of branding. There was no signage anywhere claiming the store's name. As far as we could tell, it didn't even have one. We tried the front door, half expecting the place to be closed despite the multiple 24-hour signs hanging in the windows. The door opened with the jingle of a bell. We stepped inside, and that's when it really began to feel like we'd wandered into the Twilight Zone. The place was laid out more like a massive grocery store than a gas station. There were aisles upon aisles of food in bright, colorful bags. At first glance, they almost looked like brands we recognized: chips, candy, and cereal. But when you looked closer, something wasn't quite right. There were no labels, no logos, just bright bags with bright designs. The entire store gleamed with an unnatural cleanliness. The floors shined like glass. The shelves looked freshly polished. Even the air felt sterile. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, filling the silence with a faint electric buzz. Another thing that struck me was how tall the shelves were. They towered over us, much higher than anything I'd seen in a grocery store. If someone wanted something from the top shelf, They'd need a ladder to reach it. Still, strange as it was, none of that really mattered to us. We needed a payphone. We had to call a mechanic and figure out what to do about the car. So we stood there at the front of the store for a while, pacing slowly near the registers. But there was no one there. No customers, like I said, but no cashiers either. No workers. The place was completely dead. Yet it gave off the impression that it had just opened. Triangular flags were hung in wide arcs down from the ceiling, as if a celebration were about to begin. But nobody was here. Trish called out hello to nobody in particular. Her voice echoed through the large building, bouncing off the polished floors and high shelves. We listened for a moment, expecting someone to answer, but we didn't hear anything. She shrugged at me, and we began looking around for a payphone. The aisles were long. I had the strange feeling that you could get lost in a place like this. Not the sort of lost where you wander around for a few minutes before finding the exit again, but the kind where you might never find your way back out at all. That's why I decided to stay close to the entrance. I know it sounds irrational, but there was already so much about this place that didn't seem right. Its location, and how large it was. How clean it was. The whole place had an uncanny quality to it. We were about to leave the store and check around the back of the building for a payphone when the PA system suddenly cracked to life. The loud burst of feedback made both of us jump. We waited for someone to say something ordinary. Something like, clean up on aisle 2, or attention shoppers. Instead, there was only silence. Then I heard something that made me stiffen. It was the low sound of breathing. Almost like someone with asthma, trying to pull air into their lungs. It was slow and strained, but it seemed far away, as if whoever was making the sound was standing somewhere deep in the back of the building. Trish looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We're not idiots. We headed straight for the door. Whoever worked here was either pulling some kind of joke on us, or was a certified lunatic, and we weren't interested in finding out which. Then the lights shut off. At the same moment, we heard the doors lock. An automated jingle played through the darkness, followed by the cheerful voice of a woman over the speakers. The store is now closing. We tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. We started shouting for someone to let us out, calling into the empty store, and hoping someone would answer. But once again, no one did. We stood there for a while, tense and unsure of what to do. It had already been a day from hell, and I could feel my temper starting to slip. I was ready to go off on the first person who showed their face. Then I saw something move down the dark aisle in front of me. A figure passed between the shelves. It looked like someone pushing a mop. I shouted and ran after them. Trish called for me in protest, but followed close behind. When I reached the spot where the man had been, my foot slipped out from under me, and I slammed hard into the shelf beside the aisle. When I looked down at the floor, I saw what I had slipped on. There was something there that smelled sour. It looked like curdled milk. A trail that stretched across the otherwise flawless floor, leading in the direction the janitor or store employee had been moving. Whoever it was had been leaving a mess behind him as he went. Trish asked if I was okay, but I hurried her along. We needed to find the man. We followed the foul-smelling skid marks around the bend and into the next aisle. The trail didn't disappear, but it began to thin out, fading slowly as if the source of it had begun to run dry. Then the fear I had felt earlier stopped being irrational. We were standing in the middle of an intersection of aisles. They stretched away in every direction, farther than we could see. It didn't make any logical sense. We couldn't have ran that far. It was as if the store had grown around us. I noticed a row of freezers filled with frozen food. A pale fog was spilling out of them and drifting slowly along the floor of the aisle. At first, it seemed like nothing more than freezer mist, but it was spreading farther than it should have, growing thicker the longer we stood there. Soon, it became difficult to see. Trish finally said what we both were thinking. "There's something wrong with this place." I don't know if paranormal is the right word for it, but we both had the same feeling. We had somehow ended up in a place that didn't belong to our world. The proportions were wrong. Even the air felt wrong, thick and sterile, in a way that made it hard to breathe normally. It almost felt like we were hallucinating. We tried to find our way back to the entrance, but the farther we walked, the more lost we seemed to become in the labyrinth of aisles. It didn't seem possible. None of it felt like it could truly be real. Our feet were already sore beyond belief from the miles we had walked from the car. It had been a miserable day that somehow kept finding ways to get worse. We passed shelves filled with bags of what I could only assume were chips. The bags were swollen with air, stretched tight like balloons that might burst if they were handled too roughly. Trish thought we should eat something. "What are they going to do?" she said. Something about the idea felt wrong to me. Like whatever this place was, the food here was not real, not something that could truly be consumed. By then, the freezer mist had spread all around us, gathering thick at our ankles. We were nowhere near the frozen food section anymore, but the fog had taken over the entire store. It clung to the floor like a low, pale cloud. We couldn't even see our own shoes. Trish had picked up one of the bags and was turning it over in her hands, looking for anything printed on it. There was nothing. Just a bright red bag, covered in yellow swirls, bloated and shining under the blue fluorescent light. Then she screamed and dropped it. The bag struck the floor with a sharp popping sound, and she screamed again. I ran over to her and asked what happened. "There was something moving inside it," she said. At first, I thought she was losing it, the same way I probably was. But then I saw the fog shift along the floor. It moved in quick ripples, as if something beneath it was slithering away down the aisle. Neither of us said anything. We simply stood there for a moment, trying to understand what we had just seen. Trish began to cry quietly. She wanted to leave. So did I. So we started walking in the opposite direction of whatever that thing was. We were no longer interested in finding a store attendant. We just wanted to get out. We moved slowly down the aisle, hoping we could somehow stumble across an exit. At some point, the overhead speaker crackled to life again. We both froze, waiting for something terrible to come through the system, something like a blood-curdling scream. Instead, it was just the breathing again. It somehow sounded closer than it had before. We began to pick up the pace, heading in no clear direction. It may have just been my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt like the aisles were getting tighter. The shelves seemed to be closing in on us. They still stretched endlessly ahead, but the space between them felt narrower now, and it made my chest tighten with claustrophobia. I don't know exactly when it started, but Trish and I had begun running, faster and faster. We were looking for an end to the aisles, for anything that resembled a way out. That was when I looked behind me. The janitor, the man with the mop, whatever he was. He stood far down the aisle, his silhouette outlined by the glow of freezer lights, and the thick fog pooling behind him. For a moment I almost slowed down, thinking I might call out to him. Then I looked at the floor. From his direction, dozens of thin grooves were slicing through the fog behind us. Whatever they were moving, fast. I shouted for Trish to run. She screamed, though she hadn't looked back and didn't know exactly what she was running from. Ahead of us, through the fog, we saw the end of the aisle, the cash registers, the checkout area. We ran as fast as we could until we reached the automatic doors. I was fully prepared to throw my weight into them, to smash through the glass if I had to. but just before I hit them, the doors slid open. Trish and I tumbled onto the pavement outside. The doors closed quickly behind us. None of the fog, or those things, escaped the store. The gas pump sat idle beneath the canopy. The neon signs still buzzed faintly in the windows. The building was dark again, silent, as if nothing had ever happened inside. We didn't say a word. We simply started walking back toward the car. It was approaching first light when a pickup truck finally stopped for us on the side of the road. We were 50 miles from the nearest town. In the late 90s, I went to college in New Hampshire. I was a film major, which everyone used to give me a hard time about, even back then. What are you gonna do, shoot weddings? That kind of thing. I never made anything, not really. Not even to this day. What I did do, though, was record everything. It started out innocent enough. Class projects, parties, dumb skits in the dorm. But it became an obsession. I don't like the feeling of forgetting things. Moments felt safer once they were on tape. By sophomore year, my dorm room was stacked with cardboard boxes full of VHS tapes, labeled in Sharpie. Dates, locations, sometimes just Friday or Benji's room. The camera was always up to my face, and because of that, people started calling me Camera Face. I didn't love the nickname, but I didn't stop either. A few months ago, I got nostalgic and went digging through my basement, where I dumped all that stuff years ago. The boxes were still there, dusty and warped from humidity. I bought one of those cheap USB capture cards online. Red, white, and yellow cables that connect into a little black box, and then into my laptop. The software was terrible. Half the tapes wouldn't track properly. The image would roll or freeze or tear at the top like it was trying to escape the screen. The first tape I watched was a party in my dorm. Nothing special. My girlfriend at the time, Tanya, was laughing loudly. My roommate Eric was doing a bad impression of our philosophy professor. And then there was Benji. Benji was my other roommate freshman year. He was camera shy. Like, intensely. Or at least that's how I remember thinking about it at the time. Whenever I pointed the camera at him, he'd freeze up. Just stand there, rigid. No smile. No blinking. It made people uncomfortable, even if no one ever said anything out loud. I told myself it was how he coped with it. Like, if he didn't move, didn't react, it would be over faster. The next tape was from a frat house we snuck into. Low ceilings and sticky floors. There was a girl crying on a couch, her white blouse stained with red from a spilled drink. I couldn't remember her name. Benji was standing nearby, staring at her. Not apologetic or concerned. He was just watching. Then he slowly turned his head and stared straight into the camera. That's when I started to notice a pattern. The more tapes I went through, the more Benji showed up. Sometimes front and center, sometimes way in the background, almost out of view. But always staring, and not just at the lens. It felt like he was staring at me. It felt intentional, like he knew where I'd be sitting years later. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. A bit. Maybe he thought it was funny to mess with me because of how seriously I took filming everything. But then I realized something. I couldn't remember anything about Benji that wasn't on tape. I remembered Eric. I remembered Tanya. Classes, late-night diners, stupid arguments. But when I tried to picture Benji outside of the recordings, studying, sleeping, talking to someone else, there was nothing. There was no memory, just the footage. I kept watching. Thanksgiving break, freshman year. I didn't remember Benji coming home with me. That wasn't unusual on its own. My memory from that time is spotty in places, but it bothered me how completely blank it was. No argument about space in the car. There was no explanation about where he'd sleep. There was no memory at all. When I watched the tape, though, he was there, standing in the kitchen while my mom cooked, sitting beside my dad as he carved the turkey, just staring at the camera, like always. I tried to tell myself I'd simply forgotten, that it was a long time ago, and memory can be fuzzy when you spend an entire semester smoking pot. But the more I watched, the more it felt wrong that I could remember any of it. Not him arriving, not him leaving, not anyone reacting to him being there at all. And the strangest part was the feeling that he wasn't looking at the camera. It felt like he was looking through it. One night, it was close to 2 in the morning, and I decided to watch another tape. It had become a habit by then, something to do when I couldn't sleep. I put the tape in and pressed play. Benji was standing right in front of the camera, close enough that I could see the texture of his skin, the whites of his eyes. It startled me so badly I stood up and walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. But as I did, something was caught in my peripheral vision. His eyes were moving, tracking me. I turned back toward the TV and they snapped back to center, staring straight ahead again. I know that sounds crazy. I told myself it was just the angle, just the way the footage was framed. But I didn't sit back down that night. Something about the whole thing made my skin crawl. The next day I called Eric. We hadn't spoken in years, but I needed some help remembering. Some confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. I asked him if he remembered Benji. There was a pause. Who? He asked. I said his name again. Our roommate, freshman year. Oh, Eric said after a moment. Yeah, Benji. I felt a rush of relief. I know, right? I said. He was always so weird about the camera. Yeah, Eric replied. He hated that thing. He never would even look at it. I didn't say anything after that. I just hung up and sat there, staring at my laptop screen, where Benji was still frozen in place, eyes locked, unblinking, waiting to be watched again.